What do we want to talk about?
I am him. I am him.
To bust it open, Doug Mortman, Dave LaGreca, and as promised, ridiculously excited to be joined by the author of Yes, My Improbable Journey to the Main Event of WrestleMania, the great Daniel Bryan. Daniel, Doug, Dave, glad to have you back on the show.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
First of all, the book is amazing. So many books that I've read, wrestling books, and this may be the best one just because of great way of just going through your wrestling career. So many stories to talk about, but one that really kind of jumped out for me was the Nexus invasion and you getting fired, and then the talk that you had with Vince McMahon.
Yeah. Well, the whole thing was surreal, right? I had this very not negative attitude, but I had a NXT run and everything, and then when he called and fired me, it was like it almost was like a weight lifted off my shoulders, and so yeah, it was interesting.
Well, and the conversation that you had with Vince, basically saying, hey, you know what, I can make more money on the indie scene.
Yeah, well, and that was one of my big frustrations, because the only reason I had left the indie scene, I loved being an independent wrestler, was because I realized that I was getting a lot of injuries and I needed to make more money if I wanted to do this, right? And so otherwise, and I gave myself 2009 to kind of get signed by WWE and that sort of thing. And if I didn't, what I was going to do is I was going to cut back my independent wrestling schedule and focus on college. And because I've done this since I was 18 years old, I have no other job skills. I worked at KB Toys, I baled hay, I worked at McDonald's, those aren't jobs that you want to do in your 30s, yeah. Right? And so anyway, so that was kind of my plan. But then when I went to WWE, I was actually making less money than I was on the independents.
Wow.
Because I was just doing the NXT show and that sort of thing.
Wow.
So yeah, and then with the high profile nature of my firing, I was like, I'm gonna make bank off this. and of course my version of bank was different than people who've really made bank, their version of bank. But it's different.
Yeah. Speaking of different, it's got to be a completely different scene on the indies now. I mean, think about it. Like the American Dragon for Ring of Honor back in the day. I mean, we were huge Bryan Danielson marks. So I mean, at that time, it's unfathomable that the money was that low.
Hey, guys! This is the Red Carpet Rain. We got a new book here. Well, it was published in 2014, but new to the Red Carpet Ring. It is the Daniel Bryan book called Yes, My Improbable Journey to the Main Event of WrestleMania. This is about Daniel Bryan when he proved to the world and all his WWE that looks can be deceiving, but tells to those ask anyone who's underestimating him right before he went out and whipped the WWE universe into a frenzy. And he's talking about the Yes movement, how he got popular with Yes, and all the way, from his upbringing, all the way leading to the main event of WrestleMania 30 until he became the WWE World Heavyweight Championship at the time. Now it's just the WWE Championship. But yes, this is the first part of the audiobook that was published in 2014. So I will pull that up, have that up in a second, and it's going to talk about his audiobook and everything else of that matter. And also we'll talk about, the chapters of his autobiography, his beginning and everything else. So hope you guys enjoy this audiobook. I'm going to have this up in a second because I know I enjoyed it. I read this book myself a few years ago. Like I said, I think it was published 2014. This is during the time when Daniel Bryan became champion at WrestleMania 30, defeating both Randy Orton and Batista, triple threat in the main event. Thank you all for come check out the audiobook. There will be more likely 3 parts of this audiobook, if not 2, but 3 the most. But of course, as I always do, I will leave links in the description of other parts later on to the link to part 1. So keep the notification bell on, like and subscribe. And I will also keep updated posting this audiobook. Keep the notification bell on so know when I'm posting. Greatly appreciate that, guys. With that being said, I will pull that up now. This is Daniel Bryan. Yes, my improbable journey to the main event of WrestleMania. This is the audiobook part 1. So you guys enjoy.
Macmillan Audio presents Yes, My Improbable Journey to the Main Event of WrestleMania by Daniel Bryan with Craig Tello. Read for you by Daniel Bryan. The beginning. WWE recently asked many of their successful superstars to take a personality inventory. In theory, these tests are able to assess personal qualities, such as sociability, prudence, and interpersonal sensitivity. The idea is that different professions require different personal characteristics, but these sort of analytics have never been done with professional wrestlers. If WWE could find out the personality traits of their most successful superstars, perhaps when they were recruiting, it would give them more information about the likelihood of a new signee being successful. I was one of the many people chosen to take the test. The test involved reading many different statements and then indicating if the statements were true or false. For example, one statement would be, I want to be a professional race car driver. My answer? False. I would not want to be a professional race car driver. Another example, I rarely lose my temper. My answer? True. Stuff like that. You respond to hundreds of those types of statements and voila, therein are your personality traits, in theory. I actually enjoyed taking the test and was interested to hear the results. The next day I met with a woman to talk about them. Everything was done on a percentile basis, and as we went over the results, she became more and more baffled. In all the primary markers except one, learning approach, for which I was in the 84th percentile, I scored low, and I mean very low. For interpersonal sensitivity, I was in the bottom 11th percentile. For the adjustment category, the bottom 9th percentile. Sociability, bottom 3rd. But the one that really puzzled her was my score for ambition, which was the lowest she had ever seen in her history of administering this kind of testing and data. I was in the bottom 1 percentile. She asked me how I managed to be so successful given that I seemed to have no drive, few social skills, and an inherent apathy towards most of the ideas our modern business culture seems to find so important. I have no idea, I said. I just love to wrestle. The success has come mostly by luck. My lack of ambition must have been part of my personality even from my inception, because I stayed in the womb for over 10 months. When my wife Bree heard the story, she said it explained me perfectly. She could just imagine me being completely satisfied, sitting there with an umbilical cord for a feeding tube, being constantly fed and warm and never wanting to come out. When they finally induced my mother, one can imagine how painful it must have been. My mom, Betty, was a small woman, and when I, Brian Lloyd Danielson, finally decided to come out on May 22nd, 1981, I was more than 10 pounds. Looking back at the pictures today, I'm the fattest baby I've ever seen. More importantly, I seem to always be smiling. It doesn't take much to make me happy. My mother has told me I was very quiet. I spent a lot of time on my own because I wasn't overly social, which is essentially the same as now. My father, Donald Buddy Danielson, remembered me being easygoing, but also having a really stubborn side. My dad's most consistent example of this involved cookies, which could be my favorite food group. He always talked about this time I was reaching for a cookie and he told me no. I reached again and my dad slapped my hand and then again said no. I started crying but continued reaching for the cookie. Each time my dad would lightly slap my hand and each time I would cry a little harder, relentlessly reaching for the cookie. Telling the story, he howled with laughter, but never did say whether he eventually gave me the cookie. As a young child, I had a tendency to follow my older sister, Billy Sue, around everywhere. Our relationship growing up is probably why, even today, she remains very nurturing and protective of me. Billy Sue was, and is, so much more social than I am. I just followed her around, happy as a clam, and listened to whatever she said. I picked up on whatever she did. For example, when I first learned to talk, I didn't have a stutter, but my sister did. As I spoke more and more, I started to stutter as well. Billy Sue grew out of her speech issue way before I grew out of mine, which probably wasn't until I was nearly 12 years old. Yes Conference. A good 6 months before I started my professional wrestling career, I was a senior sitting in an English class where we were all reading our essays aloud. The teacher, Dr. Carter, liked arranging our desks in a U shape around the room, so we didn't have to go to the front of the class. Stand up, read your essay, immediately sit down. That was all we had to do. I was terrified. Some people thrive when they're being looked at and feed off the energy from being put in the spotlight. Not me. I hated it. Ever since I was a kid, I've been shy. Watching my sister's children grow up, I marvel at how different they both are and how they got that way. She and I are equally different. For one, I don't think she ever had a problem speaking in front of people. Even now, she seems to do it with the utmost ease. At my wedding rehearsal, I put her on the spot. Billy Sue gave me a kind of exasperated look, asked my best man Evan for some advice, and then went on to speak. She did it with perfect poise and was funny, sweet, and in her own way, elegant. Simply stated, she nailed it. Not only did she nail it, she was also aware of this gift-giving custom and gave my wife a clam-digging shovel to welcome her to our family. If roles were reversed, I probably would have thrown up, even after years of experience going out and doing interviews in front of strangers in essentially my underwear. Before those years of experience, I was even worse. Sitting there in the U in senior English class, I was the fifth one in line to read my essay. I watched, one by one, as each person stood up, spoke, some better than others, but all of them decent, then sat down. Each time someone finished, the feeling of dread only got stronger. It's not so hard, I kept telling myself. Just get through it. By the time Dr. Carter called my name, I was full of anxiety, moist with sweat and frankly scared to death. I actually started off fine. I sped right through the first paragraph, sacrificing the maximum effect of my essay's message to wrap up quicker, which I thought was the way to go given how I was feeling. Starting with paragraph 2, I began to stutter, a problem I'd had since I was a small child. Becoming keenly aware of all the eyes looking at me, I read on, and the stuttering only got worse and worse. I paused, tried to start again, paused, tried to start again. By this point, I was messing up every other word, my sweat beating heavily from my forehead, and I was shaking. Finally, I just stopped. After a long pause, I looked at Dr. Carter and sheepishly explained that I didn't think I could continue. I couldn't do it. He allowed me to take my seat back in the comfort of the U, and horrified, I sat down so the next student could take his turn. I never finished reading my essay, and I was the only one who didn't make it through. I was incredibly embarrassed. I felt a similar unease years later when 7 of my peers and I stood nervously on the WWE set as we were about to debut on the new television show WWE NXT. The 8 of us were called rookies, though at that point I'd been wrestling for 10 years. None of us knew what to expect that night. We hadn't been told anything prior to standing there, ready to be seen on live WWE programming. About 3 minutes before showtime, a producer came in and told us one of the WWE pros was going to come on set and speak. We were to react accordingly. Another producer screamed out, "Going live in 15 seconds. Then, 5, 4. The final 3 numbers were counted down by the motion of his hand. Suddenly, the camera was panning over us and music was playing throughout the arena. The Miz, who was my assigned pro, walked onto the set. He eyed each of us up and down, turned to the camera with his back facing me, and said, "Daniel Bryan, come here." I stepped forward. The Miz started talking, but I could barely focus on what he was saying. I heard the words "internet darling" and "a star in the minor leagues," and could only assume he was talking about me. He asked me if I thought I was ready, and ironically enough, my first word in WWE was yes. Miz continued, "One thing you have to learn in WWE is you have to expect anything. So right now, I want you to go to the ring, and I want you to introduce yourself. Tell everybody exactly who you are. I want you to show personality. I want you to show charisma. I want you to give these people a reason to watch you every Tuesday night." He rambled on for a little longer, then added, "Oh, and have a good catchphrase." During the 10 years prior to my NXT debut, I had garnered a reputation for being a very skilled wrestler. But I had also garnered a reputation for not having a whole lot of charisma or verbal skills. My character, if you could call it that, was essentially just me, and I could be as understated or as over the top as I wanted to be. For the most part, if I had nothing to say or didn't want to say anything, nobody could make me. Otherwise, since I lacked natural inclination for lighting up the microphone, if I was going to do an interview, I typically would ensure I had plenty of time to prepare. Needless to say, having to do a live in-ring interview on no topic whatsoever with no time to prepare was not how I envisioned making my television debut. And I hated catchphrases. It feels like an eternity walking to the ring in WWE when no one knows who you are. WWE fans tend to be very hard on people they don't see as stars, and I could hear the groan when I came out to the Miz's entrance music. In the ring, I did my best to stay confident, or at least appear that way. By the time the ring announcer handed me the microphone, I still had no idea what I was going to say. I ended up thanking the fans for being so accepting, even though the Miz was my pro, and I told them I wish my pro had been my true mentor, William Regal. From there, I basically babbled on about NXT for another 30 seconds. Losing my train of thought and seeing the crowd lose their patience, I started to worry. Luckily, Miz's music hit and out he came. Thank goodness. Yes, I really said that. Miz immediately started ragging on me, well deservedly I might add. He asked where my personality was, where was my charisma? We bantered back and forth until he finally asked me for a catchphrase. As soon as he asked, something I had just heard in my grappling class immediately came to mind. I told him if we were ever to step in the ring and fight, he would only have two options. He would either tap or snap. It wasn't the best catchphrase in the world, and I actually couldn't use it because someone owned the rights to it. But it was enough for me to get through the interview and get a decent reaction. In response, Miz slapped me in the face and left me standing in the ring to end the segment. Not exactly a home run, more like a solid single. I knew I needed to keep working on talking, but I considered this a success, especially given I had no idea what was coming. And that's one of the reasons NXT was the most unusual wrestling experience of my career. A huge part of it was unscripted, and none of the show's rookies knew what was going on. I didn't know Miz was going to come out and save the interview. I definitely didn't know he was going to strike me at the end. Miz is self-admittedly not the toughest guy in the world, and much later on he confessed to me that he was mildly concerned I was going to fight him for the slap. The rest of the episode played to my strengths, and I wrestled Chris Jericho, who was the World Heavyweight Champion at the time, in the main event of the show. Chris is a true pro, and even though the match was only 5 minutes and I lost, he made me look like a star. After the match, Miz started beating me up, and again, I had no idea he was going to do it. Neither did he, apparently, as the instruction was sent to him from the producers through the referee in the ring. Despite the confusion and the chaos, it had been a decent debut. Yet it all went downhill from there. Making groceries. It's often said you don't choose who you fall in love with, which I believe to be true. I also believe you don't choose what you fall in love with. Sometimes things just grab hold of your imagination and never let go. And that's been my experience with professional wrestling. My introduction to wrestling is one of my earliest memories, and I've loved it ever since. I say one of and not the earliest memory because my earliest memory involved me burning my butt. After every bath at my Grandpa Austin's house, Billy Sue and I would wrap ourselves in towels and go stand by his wood-burning stove to dry off. In the cold Washington weather, the heat was always nice. One day, around age 4, I got a little too close and burned my little butt cheeks on the stove, so bad that each cheek blistered. More so than the actual burning, the most vivid memory is the pain I felt each time I'd sit on the toilet. I'm lucky I don't have scars, especially since I spend so much time on broadcast television in trunks. There have also been quite a few live crowds who have seen my derriere. How would parents explain those scars to their kids? "If I show you, you have to promise not to tell anybody," whispered the new kid in class. It had been Abe's first day as a student at Aberdeen Central Park Elementary School, but he had already made friends. At the end of the school day, Abe was being chased around a table by my best friend Warren, as he sang, La Cucaracha, please don't hit me in the butt." He and Warren came back to my house that same afternoon. We found ourselves in my bedroom, huddling around Abe's backpack. Warren and I were anxious and excited about what Abe was about to show us. Abe looked from side to side, as if he suspected someone was watching us while he slowly unzipped his backpack. He double-checked to make sure we weren't going to tell anybody before he reached in and pulled out a stack of magazines. Wrestling magazines. Abe handed us each a magazine, and I pored over the pictures. Men with enormous muscles and ridiculous outfits fought equally ridiculous men. There were giants, midgets, Indians, cowboys, Russians, men with face paint and spikes. I had never seen anything like it. It was magic. Warren quickly lost interest, but I couldn't stop flipping through the pages. I convinced Abe to let me borrow a few of the magazines, and it was through their worn pages that I became hooked on wrestling. It wasn't long before my parents found me reading the magazines that I was supposed to keep secret. Hiding things has never been my forte. Fortunately, I had nothing to worry about. Despite not being wrestling fans themselves, my parents weren't upset. They actually liked the fact that I was trying to read. Plus, they saw that it made me happy. Before I knew it, my parents started bringing me home wrestling magazines when they saw a new one come out. Slowly but surely, I became a better reader, which was important because I missed a lot of school. I have a lot of harebrained hypotheses, most of which are too idiotic to be printed. Ask Nigel McGuinness about my thoughts on the evolution of penis size. But this one idiot hypothesis mildly pertains to the story, so here goes nothing. It is my belief that due to modern medicine, humans have stopped evolving in a way that produces healthier adults. I say this because many children who 200 years ago would have died are now living to successfully reproduce. Thus, they pass on their genetic deficiencies to their children, who then pass them on to their children, and so on and so forth. I am one of those children, sick my entire childhood, and even still often sick as an adult. Without modern medicine, I would have surely passed before I could procreate. Who knows, I still might. Regardless, I affectionately refer to myself as a defect. Bree is also a defect. I will let her explain her own defectiveness in her own book, should she choose to write one. Before we started dating, I pointed this out to her and also told her that it would be genetically irresponsible for either of us to have children, as it would weaken the evolution of humans going forward. What we should be doing as a species is breeding intelligent super athletes, like having John Cena make babies with Jackie Joyner Kersey. It became our little joke, both of us being defects, and we will, at some point, try our best with the de-evolution of our species. My persistent illness started with viral asthma, and as we later found out, I was allergic to grass and trees and almost all animal hair, which didn't stop me from trying to sleep with my beagle Millie nearly every night. Oftentimes, I would wake up with my eyes swollen nearly shut. After my allergies were discovered, I began getting weekly injections, which helped to a degree. Still, whenever I was outside or playing sports, grass would get the better of me. I ended up getting quite a few upper respiratory infections, and there would be times I would miss a week or two of school at a time. One December, I missed nearly the entire month leading up to Christmas break. Missing so much school, I suspect, made me even less social, but on the flip side, I became comfortable entertaining myself and developing my interests. I still always managed good grades, mostly because school came relatively easy to me. Math seemed like a fun little puzzle for me to figure out, and I enjoyed reading. That pretty much covers elementary education. Being out sick all the time, I never learned to swim properly because lessons were during school. Other than swimming, being sick didn't stop me from doing much. Despite my grass allergies, I was always playing sports, mostly because I love being outside. At different points, I played just about everything: soccer, football, baseball, and basketball. I ran track, did cross country, wrestled, and even tried golf one summer with some clubs borrowed from a friend. I played every sport and wasn't good at any of them. I never had the mentality necessary to be good at sports. They were just games to me and relatively unimportant. It was hard for me to care about winning and losing. As long as there wasn't too much pressure, I had fun. That's why I loved practice. Some people hated drilling, and they saw practice as work. I saw it as being able to play against my friends with no pressure. I liked the drills in almost every sport because it was fun for me to see functional improvement. My love of sports turned into a love of sports cards, even though I tended to look at them more as an investment than as a hobby. My generation of kids was the first to save their sports cards, because they'd be worth money someday. Back then, I thought my sister was stupid for saving her money instead of buying cards like I did. I believed the cards were going to appreciate in value, unlike my sister's savings, which she just kept in her bedroom, accruing absolutely no interest. It was predominantly baseball cards at first, then expanded to basketball cards and football cards. I even had some wrestling cards. Interestingly, or unfortunately, depending on how you look at it, I didn't ever like the Michael Jordan types. I ended up collecting a lot of players who were good, but not necessarily stars. In baseball, instead of liking Ken Griffey Jr., who was on the Seattle Mariners and whose cards were always worth a lot, I liked Roberto Alomar and Paul Molitor. I figured, oh, Paul Molitor's so good. When people realize how good he is, his card is going to be worth money. Sometimes I'd trade a card of Frank Thomas, who was huge at the time, for a couple of Roberto Alomars. Even though I wasn't great at understanding the real value of sports cards, my first attempt at being an entrepreneur involved trying to sell the cards with my friend Scott. During the summer, weather permitting, we would set up a table outside of my house, organize our cards all businessmen-like, and tape up a sign out front that read, "Baseball cards for sale." There was never a ton of traffic on our street, and usually our only customers were kids who didn't have any money, so would end up playing football or wiffle ball in the front yard. After one summer, Scott and I combined all the money we saved, which was a total of $40. In our heads, this must have seemed like $1 million, because we were convinced we'd be able to start this trading card empire with that cash. We only ended up being able to pay for a single box of Leaf baseball cards, which was a disappointment. Still, I continued collecting cards until I was 14, and I kept them in the attic in case they'd be worth something someday. They're not. Unfortunately, sports cards of that time, much like the comic books I also still have, were so mass-produced that there's no scarcity, and they're worth less than when I collected them in the 80s and 90s. It turns out my sister made the better decision after all. That's where a functional understanding of economics would have really served me well. Just like the wrestling magazines helped out my reading, sports cards served a purpose as well. There are all sorts of statistics on the back of cards, and I was hell-bent on figuring out what they all meant. Figuring out things like batting averages and field goal percentages gave me a better understanding of division, percentages and decimal points, and it made math seem fun rather than a bore. Plus, looking up the value of cards in the pricing magazines helped when it came time to find things in the dictionary or scan reference material in the library. Education can be fun if framed in the right way. Selling sports cards wasn't the only way I tried to make money as a kid. After my parents' divorce, we didn't have much money. As soon as my sister turned 16, she got a job at McDonald's, and when I turned 15, she was able to help get me a job there, too. Long prior to my years in the workforce, my passion for wrestling deepened when I discovered I could actually watch it on television. We didn't watch much TV and didn't have cable, so the thought had previously never occurred to me. Suddenly, the characters that I read about in magazines had sprung to life. Seeing the Ultimate Warrior lift a grown man above his head and drop him to the mat for a press slam was even more impressive than it looked in the pictures. A photo of someone standing on the top rope was no match for watching the grace, movement, and destruction of a Macho Man Randy Savage elbow drop. Since I had no concept of television programming, I'd flip through the channels every time I'd turn on the TV in hopes of catching some form of wrestling. It took me some time, I can be a slow learner, but I finally realized that it came on every Saturday morning. I was the sole wrestling fan in the family, but the only time I remember anybody in the house getting annoyed with my fandom was during the NFL playoffs. It seemed to me that football season was my dad's favorite time of the year. He loved watching football, and the Seattle Seahawks, our hometown team, whom he'd followed since their first season in 1976. Most years they were pretty bad, but in 1988 the Seahawks won their division for the first time and were playoff bound. The game was on a Saturday against the Cincinnati Bengals, and all week my dad had talked about watching it, but I insisted on watching wrestling. I must have been arguing relentlessly to watch my Saturday morning show because my dad, usually as patient as could be, was finally exasperated. The playoffs only happen for a couple weeks a year, and the Seahawks are playing, he said. Wrestling is on every single week. I eventually gave in, but was disappointed because the British Bulldogs were wrestling that day. I love Davey Boy Smith and Dynamite Kid. Not so much because Dynamite was one of the most revolutionary performers of all time, as because I thought their dog, Matilda, was so cute. At first, my friend Abe was the only other kid I knew who was really into wrestling. When I would occasionally go over to his house, we'd play with the giant rubber LJ and Toys action figures. It seemed like he had all of them, Not just the popular wrestlers like Hulk Hogan and Jake the Snake Roberts, but even some of the more obscure characters like Special Delivery Jones and Outback Jack. Plus, he had 2 rings, so we could each make them fight. Before long, though, Abe lost interest in wrestling, and it just became my own little thing for a while. It wasn't until I was in middle school that I found other kids who liked wrestling too. The biggest development was when I found out that my friends Tony Sajak, Skylar Parker, and John Manio had created their own wrestling league, which they called Backyard Championship Wrestling, BCW, despite most of the action taking place indoors. Sometimes they'd wrestle each other, but most of the matches involved Big Bad Brown, a giant teddy bear who was also their champion. At some point, they invited me and my friend Evan Aho over, and it became a regular thing. Eventually, Big Bad Brown retired, and our wrestling evolved into something else entirely. At first, it was at Tony's house, where Big Bad Brown resided, and we just kind of wrestle on the floor. Soon, we moved the fun to my house, and by the end of high school, my best friends were the guys who would watch wrestling pay-per-views at my place regularly. It was Mike Dove and his brother Jake, Evan and his younger brother Christoph, Tony, Skylar, and John. The first WWE show I ordered was the Royal Rumble in 1996. Then we got WrestleMania 12, which had the epic main event Iron Man match between Bret Hitman Hart and Shawn Michaels. Before the show started, we'd clear everything out of our family room and lay out a mattress on the floor, thus transforming the room into the BCW arena. The corners of the room were the turnbuckles, the walls were the ropes we'd bounce off of, and the couch was the top rope in case we wanted to do a Macho Man elbow drop or something. If you've been a wrestling fan for an extended period of time, you've probably either seen or heard of Mick Foley's backyard wrestling adventures, particularly the moment in which he jumped off the top of his house. Our wrestling was different. Sometimes we would actually try to seriously learn the moves we'd seen on TV, but more often we'd just be goofing off. My friend Skylar was Hip Skip, whose character never stopped running for 24 hours straight. He would come running from down the street, open the sliding glass door, run in, do a match, then run back out. There was also El Bate, a wrestler in a Batman mask who'd often appear in videos we'd made for our Spanish class, despite El Bate actually meaning baseball bat, not anything to do with Batman. I like to think that because we weren't doing the crazier stuff, what we were doing was safe. The truth is, it wasn't, which is why WWE now does all those videos telling people to not try it at home. And since it was my house, and I seriously wanted to be a pro wrestler, I was constantly practicing things I thought I might need to know, like backflips off the couch. We did it all on a mattress, so we never thought of landing on someone as dangerous. We only looked at the jumping, twisting, and backflipping as the dangerous part. Unfortunately, one time I jumped off my couch for a twisting senton and landed back first directly on Christoph's face, breaking his jaw. He had to have his jaw wired shut and was only able to eat through a straw for weeks. I didn't want anything to stop our wrestling, so I never told my mom what happened. We had already been given a warning after cracking the drywall in the corner that we used as a turnbuckle, and I thought something as serious as this injury would end our wrestling for good. My mom didn't find out until much later when she was talking to Christoph's mother, Pam, who had been very cool about the incident. When Pam made mention of Christoph's broken jaw, my mom was like, "Wait, what?" Luckily, despite my injuring him, Christoph remains my friend to this day. He and Evan and Mike were all groomsmen in my wedding, almost 2 decades later. Christoph still tells me that at some point he's going to break my jaw in return. Whenever I see him, he always asks, "Is it now?" My hometown of Aberdeen, Washington is a blue-collar town, filled with good, hard-working people. It's built on the timber industry, and there are signs all over that say working forests equal working families. Our house was next to a big sprawl of woods in a suburb of Aberdeen called Central Park. It was basically just our place, the people next door, and a large parcel of wooded area we called Oscar's Creek, named after one of the neighbors' Labradors who loved to play in that spot. I remember rope swings over ravines, even with my fear of heights, and essentially growing up around all the trees. Being around living things like trees, plants, and ferns is what I prefer, and being raised in this environment is definitely what made me love nature. Sometimes my dad took us fishing, and I hated it. He told me that fish don't feel any pain, but I didn't believe it. Catching a fish is a very violent affair. I always put myself in the position of the fish. I envisioned me spotting a cookie, eating the cookie, then suddenly getting hooked by my mouth, dragged across the street, dumped in some water, and forced to stay under the water until I die. Exactly what happens to a fish, but the opposite. Years after our fishing trips, I still have this awesome picture of me, my sister, and my dad holding 2 fish. He's smiling, my sister's smiling, and there I am, looking at the fish, horrified. Writing about my father is the most difficult part of this book. I love my father. All of him. My mom says to this day that in the absence of alcohol, my dad was the best man she's ever known. She says that still, over 20 years after their divorce. But then there's the other side. Addiction is a terrible thing, and one with which my family has a long history. My father was the youngest of 6 children, all of whom either had alcohol or drug problems or were complete teetotalers. My dad battled with alcohol addiction his entire life. I related to my dad better than I did to anybody else. Billy Sue says it's because we're exactly the same, minus the alcohol. I always take that as a compliment because he was smart, kind, and funny. He was genuinely sympathetic towards people. And most importantly, he always made sure we knew we were loved. My parents were high school sweethearts who married relatively young. My mom was 20, my dad 19. My mom waitressed to help put my dad through school as he got his engineering tech degree. But once he graduated, he went to work in the logging industry as a log scaler, measuring and grading the cut trees. My dad loved the outdoors and loved logging, which, unfortunately, isn't the most stable job in the world. Shortly after I was born, we moved to Vernal, Utah, where my dad had gotten a different position that was supposedly going to be a little more steady. According to my aunt and uncle, my dad always had an issue with alcohol, but my mom first noticed it when we lived in Utah. We were only there for 6 months before we moved to Albany, Oregon, so my dad could pursue scaling again, and then back to Aberdeen. During all that time, my dad was caught in an addiction cycle. He'd be in and out of alcohol programs, which brought times of sobriety, 3 weeks, 6 weeks sometimes, then it would start again. My dad's drinking got substantially worse when his father died of emphysema, and then a year later his mom died of cancer. After that, my parents were pretty much divorced, although I don't remember the exact timing of it. My mom and my sister don't either. It's strange how there can be such a collective forgetfulness. All of that said, my dad was still a very loving father. The only reason I bring up his drinking is because it helps explain why I don't drink and never have. When kids started drinking, I immediately saw it as a negative and not cool at all. Though they were separated, we would still go over and see him all the time. My dad played catch with me, came to my sporting events when he wasn't working, and took us camping. We went to my dad's house on Christmas Eve, and he played Santa until we got old enough to know it was him. On Christmas morning, we'd wake up, eat cinnamon rolls my mom made on our wood stove, then open presents, including perhaps my favorite Christmas present, a set of 30 RF video VHS tapes of all the Extreme Championship Wrestling house shows. My parents' divorce was very hard on my mother, because she'd been a stay-at-home mom. She didn't have much more than a high school education and had done a lot of waiting tables until my sister and I were born. My mom didn't know what to do, as there were very few jobs in Aberdeen that would pay a woman with no education and limited job skills, who hadn't worked in years, enough money to support a family. But my mom wouldn't give up. She started by volunteering at the Satsup's nuclear power plant, giving tours and such. She worked so hard that they hired her, but the power plant was never fully completed, and after a couple of years, my mom was laid off. My sister and I never heard a complaint from her about any of it. Soon she started going to the community college, even though she had to take some classes that didn't even count for credits towards her degree, just so she could catch up. My mom worked hard while back in school, and on top of that, she worked 2 jobs, each at a different department store. And she never, to use a wrestling term, sold being tired to us. Looking back, I will never know how she did it, because she was always there to pick us up from our various practices, she always came to our games, and she made us every meal. We never ate out. I can't imagine how she had enough hours in the day. My mom worked her butt off and graduated with her bachelor's degree in 1999, a few days before I graduated from high school. She went on to get her master's degree in counseling psychology, and she's worked in that field, helping people, ever since. My mom also remarried, although well after I started to wrestle. Her husband is a terrific smart man named Jim, and they live together to this day. Trained to win. When you're a kid, people constantly ask you what you want to be when you grow up. I don't recall if it was immediately at first sight that I knew I wanted to be a professional wrestler, but looking back, I don't remember ever wanting to be anything else. Of course, when you're young, nobody laughs when you say you want to be a professional wrestler, because a lot of kids want to be something that seems relatively implausible to adults. But as you get older, you're expected to start thinking more realistically about a career, especially if, like me, you in no way, shape, or form stand out in a crowd. No matter, whenever anyone asked, I always said I wanted to be a pro wrestler. Sometimes people would laugh. Sometimes they would say that it sounded fun, but I should probably go to college first. The response that gave me the hardest time was this: how do you get into wrestling? I had no idea. In Pro Wrestling Illustrated, they had these advertisements that read, "Learn to be a professional wrestler." You'd pay $20 to get the book and become a pro wrestler. That simple? I was sold. I bought multiple books like that. I use the term book loosely because they were more like a phone book of resources, although reduced to about 20 pages, than actual guidebooks. They told me that I had to get some wrestling gear and suggested reputable gear places. They said I needed to get some wrestling boots and noted places where they could be ordered. That's essentially all they did. The most important instruction was that I needed to go to wrestling school, and I needed to go to a good one. One of the books highlighted the Malenko School of Wrestling, and I knew exactly where I needed to go. I was a sophomore in high school, and Dean Malenko was my favorite wrestler. It's interesting how taste can change in just about anything. When I was first introduced to wrestling, I loved the colorful characters and adored pretty much anybody who came to the ring with an animal. Jake the Snake, Coco Beware, and the British Bulldogs were always at the top of my list. But my absolute favorite was the Ultimate Warrior. Though he wasn't a great technical wrestler, not that I knew any better at the time, Warrior sprinted to the ring and, with incredible energy, shook the top rope like a maniac. He wore neon tights with matching tassels and had the physique of a superhero. He was everything I loved about wrestling when I was 9 years old. As I got a little bit older, I started liking wrestlers not just because of their persona, their appearance, or their entrance, but mostly because of their performance inside the ring. I was drawn to guys like Bret Hitman Hart and Arn Anderson, excellent ring technicians, but still big men. Although I always wanted to be a wrestler, I had doubts because the guys I saw on TV were so big. Even a guy like the 1-2-3 Kid, who was an underdog because of his size, was over 6 feet tall. I was only 5'8". Then, in 1995, World Championship Wrestling created the Cruiserweight title and brought in some wrestlers who started to give me hope that my size wouldn't be an issue. All of a sudden on my TV every week were guys like Eddie Guerrero, Chris Benoit, and Dean Malenko, who were my height or shorter and had wrestled in Mexico, Europe, and Japan, learning different styles everywhere they went. Guerrero and Benoit wrestled each other in a match on WCW Saturday Night that was so good it made me start recording wrestling so I could watch the matches again and again. Dean Malenko was the one who appealed to me the most. A no-nonsense wrestler, he was introduced as the man of 1,000 holds, and when he first started in World Championship Wrestling, WCW, they shot vignettes of him stretching guys with various submissions. My favorite was his Texas Cloverleaf, where he figure-four'd a man's legs with his arms and then turned him over onto his stomach, looking like he was bending his opponent in half. I started trying it on all my friends, and true to form, it hurt. In 1996, at WCW's Great American Bash, the first WCW pay-per-view I ever ordered, Dean wrestled the debuting Rey Mysterio Jr. for the Cruiserweight Championship in a match that convinced me there was no excuse for me to not follow my dream. Both men were shorter than me, but between Dean's aggressive mat wrestling and Rey being the most spectacular high flyer I had ever seen, not a single person watching would have noticed. They transcended the preconceived notion that most people had, myself included, that wrestlers had to be big. Shortly after I turned 16, I called to inquire about the Malenko School of Wrestling, using the number I saw in one of my books. A lady named Phyllis Lee picked up and answered all of my questions, including cost. It was $2,500 to enroll, but you needed to give them a $500 deposit to secure your spot. For whatever reason, I had presumed that there were people lined up all over the world to go to Dean Malenko's school, and that I would need to send in my deposit as quickly as possible to ensure there'd be a place for me. Working at McDonald's and filling their meat trays, I saved up enough money for wrestling school that summer. Once I had the deposit, I immediately called the school, and I said I wanted to hold my spot. And I sent Phyllis Lee my $500, solidifying what I thought was my post-graduation plan, nearly 2 years before I even graduated. By this point, my mom had accepted I was going to try to be a wrestler, but she wanted me to go to college while I did it. Surprisingly, Dr. Carter, my junior and senior year English teacher, was very influential in my decision to wholeheartedly pursue wrestling and not go to college immediately. One day, he was talking about his stint in the Peace Corps and how that experience gave him a whole new perspective on the world. It made him realize he wanted to teach. He questioned how students were supposed to go straight from high school to college and know exactly what they wanted to be without much real-world experience. While most of my teachers thought I should have a backup plan before I started wrestling, Dr. Carter encouraged me to try wrestling first, and if it didn't work out, the colleges would always be there. Even though I was a relatively good student and graduated with honors, the closer I got to graduation, the more I hated school. I enjoyed learning math and science, but the classes were slow. I loved Dr. Carter's English class, though most of school felt pointless and seemed like an inefficient use of nearly 8 hours a day. I spent as much time as I possibly could mentally and physically preparing for wrestling the best I knew how. I wanted to get in the best shape possible, so I developed my own training regimen, which meant working out on my own time and not during phys ed. I read books on strength training. I worked on bridging to strengthen my neck and worked on backflips because I thought I'd have to be a high flyer. I bought Japanese and Mexican wrestling tapes through a catalog I found on the internet. I watched as much wrestling as I could, and I wrote down every move I saw in a binder filled with things I wanted to learn. The issue was that I needed to work so I could pay for wrestling school. At the time, I was working 2 minimum wage jobs, one at McDonald's and one for KB Toys. With all that, I didn't think I had time for school, so I lied to get out of it. The biggest lie I ever told. I'm pretty much the worst liar I know, which is why today I'm surprised that my plan worked so well. I told my teachers I had gotten this job at one of the logging places in town, which would pay way more than my other jobs, but they needed me to work during the day. I asked if I could do all my schoolwork at home and just come in to take my tests. Everyone was cool with it. All I'd need is a letter from my mom saying it was okay, and a letter from the boss saying the job was legit. The job was not legit. It was just an excuse not to go to school, so I forged both letters, one from my mother and the other from my fictional boss. Then I just stopped going. It was way easier than it had any right to be. Sometimes I still have nightmares that I never actually graduated from high school. In the dream, I walk up to get my diploma and someone pulls me aside and tells me they caught me and I will have to repeat my senior year. I still feel guilty about this deception. Everything I was doing in my life was to get ready for wrestling, but I couldn't prepare for what happened next. 3 months before I graduated and was planning to head down to Florida, I got a call from Phyllis Lee to explain that unfortunately, the Malenko School of Wrestling had closed down. Phyllis apologized, and when I asked for my $500 deposit back, she said, "I'm sorry, we don't have it anymore." I couldn't believe it. When you're only making $4.90 an hour, $500 is a lot of fucking money. Also, not only did I lose the money, I lost the chance to be trained by my favorite wrestler. In 3 months, I was graduating, and I had no idea what I was going to do. I wallowed around for a couple weeks after I got the news. I called other wrestling schools, but none of them made me feel confident I was going to get good training. I didn't know where to go or who to trust. Finally, what seemed like bad luck ended up being the best thing that could have happened to me. Shortly after I was told Dean's school was closing, Shawn Michaels announced he was opening up a wrestling school of his own. While I was watching Monday Night Raw, an ad flashed a 900 number, which I called for a significant fee to request more information about the Shawn Michaels Wrestling Academy. I figured a Shawn Michaels wrestling program had to be great, but as soon as I called, I started to worry it was a scam. The phone number cost money, but then all it told you was to mail them another $20 in order to receive the information. Despite being hesitant, I gave it a shot. When the pamphlet for the school came in the mail, I was demoralized again. The school was going to cost $3,900, which was $1,400 more than I had planned, and even worse because I had lost the $500. The pamphlet contained another number to call to say if you were interested. Yet again, the call cost money, and I almost didn't do it. I didn't know what else to do, though, so I called. When I finally talked to somebody, it ended up being Shawn Michaels' mom, Carol, who was handling a lot of the logistics of the school. Carol was absolutely wonderful and a godsend. Since I had limited social skills and didn't even know what questions to ask, my mom talked to Carol more than I did. My mom was, naturally, concerned. As a family, we weren't exactly well-traveled, and Shawn's school was in San Antonio, Texas. To us, that was so far away, it might as well have been Mars. My mom was worried about my safety in such a big city, especially since I wouldn't know anyone there and wasn't overly good at making friends. We didn't have great internet at the house in 1999. It was dial-up, so it was really hard to get information. We tried to find an apartment, but we didn't know anything about the neighborhoods in San Antonio, and it was an expensive city. My mother had a ton of questions, and Carol answered them all. I'm sure it helped that she had watched her own son embark on the same journey years ago, so she knew the stress a mother would experience. Carol explained to us that they had made an agreement with an apartment complex in San Antonio for the people coming in from out of the area. It wouldn't be super nice, but it would be in a safe neighborhood. If I wanted a roommate, they'd put me together with someone else coming to the school, and we could sign a lease together. Though my mom still had concerns, Carol was able to reassure her enough so that she wasn't a nervous wreck when I ultimately left. Fortunately, the Academy accepted month-to-month payments of $1,300 if you didn't have the full $3,900 tuition up front. I cut all unnecessary spending and saved every penny I could. Even though she had hardly any money, my mom helped me out too, without which I wouldn't have made it. The night I graduated from high school, I went to our class graduation party and said goodbye to my friends, who were all super stoked that I was going to wrestle. One of my friends even made me a little championship belt. I left the party around midnight and I went straight home to pack up all my stuff in the car, then started driving to San Antonio. I didn't sleep because I was too excited. The drive from Aberdeen, Washington to San Antonio, Texas is just a little under 2,500 miles, and there's really only two major roads. You take I-5 south for over 1,000 miles until you get to Los Angeles, and then you take I-10 east for over 1,000 miles until you get to San Antonio. Pretty easy, actually. This was my first of many long cross-country trips, and not only did I enjoy it, I discovered that I'm a good long-distance driver. The only time I stopped was for gas or to sleep a couple of hours. I probably could have been a relatively good truck driver, though my dad would have been furious. He had this funny disdain for truck drivers, having dealt with them for years in the logging industry. The only rule my dad ever really had for my sister about dating was this: never marry a truck driver. For the trip, I only packed what fit in my little teal 1992 Geostorm. I brought some blankets, pillows, and a sleeping bag. I had a bag of clothes, a small TV with a VCR built in, and a box of all my wrestling tapes, which took up the most space by far. That was it. Even though I arrived before my official move-in date, I was able to get into my apartment early the next day thanks to the nice ladies who worked there. You could tell some were mothers by the way they sympathized with my naivete. The apartment was a small one-bedroom. I shared it with another trainee named AJ from Florida, who slept in the bedroom, mostly because he owned a bed, while I slept in my sleeping bag on the living room floor. He was around 30, which felt so much older than me at the time, and he had long black hair, wore leather jackets, and had a cool car. By winter, AJ had left San Antonio, and it started getting cold. The apartment was freezing, and no matter how high I turned up the thermostat, the heat would never come on. I spent over a month bundled up in my warmest clothes before I finally called the office. The repairman came by, looked at the thermostat for less than 3 seconds, and pushed a switch that read cool to the position that read heat. I felt like an idiot for missing something so obvious. The Shawn Michaels Wrestling Academy was in a grubby part of San Antonio, on top of a Mexican restaurant called Doña Juanita's. It wasn't quite what I expected. I thought it would be more like the WWE Performance Center is today, but inside there was just a ring with a few weightlifting machines, and it was really, really hot. The guys who lived next door would sit outside on top of their cars and drink beer all day. I was constantly terrified that my car would get broken into or stolen. I later found out that someone was giving them cases of beer to watch our cars. I don't think anyone's car was ever broken into. On the first day of training, we all got to the academy early. I get nervous doing just about anything for the first time, whether it's going to a new yoga studio or taking a class at the botanical garden. Needless to say, walking up those stairs and finally reaching the moment of my first wrestling class had the butterflies in my stomach going crazy. AJ had told me a rule in wrestling was to introduce yourself and shake hands with everyone in the locker room, so I greeted all my fellow trainees. Some of the guys were already laughing and joking, and the comfort they projected put me a little more at ease. But then the room went quiet as Shawn Michaels walked in. Shawn Michaels, in my opinion, is the best American wrestler of his generation. Being the best in wrestling is subjective, of course, so not everyone will agree. But he was a true superstar in my eyes and the first wrestler I ever met. When I was 7, I watched him as part of the Rockers when he first came to the WWE. My friend Skylar impersonated him all the time when we were in middle school. This was the guy who won the Royal Rumble the first time I ever ordered pay-per-view in 1996, and he was in the main event of the first WrestleMania I ordered, in which he competed in a 60-minute Iron Man match with Bret Hart to win the WWE Championship for the first time. If Shawn Michaels had a big match on pay-per-view, I ordered it because I knew I'd be getting my money's worth. He had retired a year earlier because his back had gotten really bad, and the general feeling was that he would never wrestle again. When he walked in the door that first day, I was in awe. Once 9 a.m. hit, Shawn gathered us around and introduced himself and the other trainers, and soon after that we started training. My first day of training was a real eye-opener. I had tried to come to the school in the best shape possible, and I was confident in my conditioning, but we were on the second floor of a building with no air conditioning. We started with conditioning, doing some running, some bodyweight exercises like squats and push-ups, and some circuit training. I looked around and could see the heat taking its toll on the other trainees. A few of them started throwing up during this portion of the training, which lasted more than an hour. Next, we did some gymnastic-type rolls inside the ring. Between the heat, the exhaustion, and the dizziness created by the tumbling, guys were throwing up left and right. Some made it to the bathroom, some only made it to the window to puke onto the sidewalk below, and some didn't make it to either. They just vomited on the floor. I did my best to resist the urge, and out of all the guys, Lance, Cade, and I were the only ones who didn't throw up. We finished off the day running sprints, and at the end, Shawn gave us a pep talk. I was so exhausted I don't even remember what he said. For me, beginnings are always the hardest, and I felt great knowing that I'd completed my first day of wrestling training. Though Shawn had started a part-time class earlier in the year, we were his first full-time class, and as a class, we were very successful. In many wrestling schools, a majority of the guys who start training never even have a match. Out of the 20 guys who started in that first class, more than half ended up being able to wrestle at least a couple matches, and 3 of us, Lance Cade, Brian Kendrick, and myself, ended up holding championships in WWE. Lance caught Shawn's eye from the very beginning. He was a big guy from Nebraska, tall, 6'5", muscular, and athletic. He was good looking too, with his long blonde hair and only 18 at the time. The first day of training, among all the calisthenics and rolls, we also did something involving jumping. Lance could jump to the moon, and when Shawn saw him jump so high, he immediately said, in front of everyone, "I smell money." It was clear that Lance was one of Shawn's early favorites. It took me and Brian Kendrick a little longer to catch Shawn's attention. We were both smaller, me at 5'8" and Brian at 5'6", but we would work our hardest at every drill, no matter how mundane. In fact, because of our shared work ethic, it didn't take long for Brian and me to become friends. Brian is great, both as a wrestler and as a person, and I was lucky we attended class at the same time. He had grown up in Lacey, Washington, only about an hour from Aberdeen, and he loved wrestling every bit as much as I did. Even though it was Shawn's school and he was there for almost every class, Rudy Boy Gonzalez was our primary trainer. Rudy was a character. Though only 5'8", he had an enormous stomach that was hard as a rock, plus the biggest head I had ever seen. But he was really agile and hilarious to boot. He'd been wrestling for years, and he was an excellent trainer and one of the main reasons for my early success. Mandatory class days were Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday from 9 a.m. until noon, but Brian and I were training way more than that. Rudy stayed late working with us, and he'd open the gym any day we wanted to come in and train. At first, he would just help us with the basics we learned in class, though soon he was teaching us anything we wanted to learn, like space-flying tiger drops or moonsaults to the floor. If Brian or I saw something on a tape and wanted to learn it, Rudy would try to teach it to us. There are some things we just weren't physically capable of doing, but you don't find that out until you try. Every time we fouled something up, Rudy gave us some advice or shared his perspective on how we could have done it better. Just being there for us and so liberally sharing his knowledge, Rudy inspired us to work harder. His passion for teaching really stood out. Shawn's passion for wrestling was apparent as well, and seeing it humanized him for me. Gradually, he turned from being a superstar I was in awe of to a coach I respected, admittedly with a little bit of awe. For a long time, I focused on wrestling to the exclusion of everything else. Even though I didn't have very much money, I worked as little as possible. I would get whatever crappy minimum wage job I could find that would work with my schedule, and as soon as I saved up enough money to pay my bills for a month or two, I would quit. One time, I thought I'd hit the jackpot with a job as a stock boy for Victoria's Secret. My first day was supposed to be on a Friday, but last minute, I was asked to do ring crew for a show. I called in and asked if I could start on a different day, and the manager told me she'd call me back with my new start date. She never called me back. Instead of working with bras and panties, I ended up getting a pretty good job at a Christian bookstore where we shipped Bibles to churches. I had it for a month, then quit. Luckily, my half of the rent was only $200, and I knew how to live on very little money. That meant I would have to eat peanut butter and jelly tortillas, which were cheaper than bread, all the time. If you don't require very much money to live, it gives you a certain amount of freedom, and that freedom allowed me to commit 100% of myself to wrestling. Wrestling training is difficult, mostly because the contact is so unique. There's a lot of contact in sports like football, but not the same kind. If I'm a wide receiver trying to jump for a pass in the middle of the field, there's a good chance I'm going to get leveled, but the receiver tries to not get leveled, and the quarterback attempts to throw the ball in the best possible position for the receiver to make the catch and do so without his head getting taken off. Wrestling is different. When my opponent gives me a shoulder tackle, I try to attack the mat, taking a bump as hard and as fast as possible, plus try to do it safely. Trying to unlearn years of attempting to not fall down is hard and hard on the body. As training went on, guys started dropping out. Some people walked away because of injuries, some because they had personal issues, and some because wrestling turned out to be tougher than they thought. My roommate AJ ended up leaving halfway through the class because he had some issues to address back in Florida. Fortunately, he paid his half of the rent for the rest of the term of our lease, for which I was grateful. It opened up space in the apartment for Kendrick to come stay, so he wouldn't have to drive to Austin every night. Not only did I enjoy his company, but it gave him more time and energy to train, which made us both better. Slowly but surely, we learned enough to have matches, starting with basic matches and training after about 7 weeks. At first, Shawn and Rudy would just tell us exactly what to do. While we were in the ring, Rudy would say something like, "Bryan, grab a headlock." I would grab the headlock. Then he would say, "Now take him down." I would take the guy down. He would tell my opponent to head scissors me, which he would, and we would continue until Rudy would end the match by calling for a move like a small package and telling the pinned person not to kick out. Soon, we were coming up with our own matches at the academy. Boy, were they rotten. If you have never seen someone's first attempt at having a match, it's comical, and mine was no different. But as we kept training, the matches got better. I was sitting at home on a Sunday afternoon when Rudy called me and told me I was having my first professional wrestling match in 2 days. I was so excited I could barely talk. When I finally could, I mumbled a thank you and then asked, "What should I wear for gear?" Rudy said not to worry. He knew a guy and was coming over to pick me up in about an hour. A few weeks prior to this call, Shawn was talking with us after class. He said if we hadn't already, we should start thinking about our wrestling names. I didn't have any good ideas other than using my real name, so I asked Shawn what he thought. He tucked his chin, thought it over for a second, then responded with, "How about the American Dragon?" I didn't really like it, but was too afraid to tell him. "Why?" I asked. "Because you wrestle like a Japanese guy," he responded. I took that as a compliment. Thus, the American Dragon was born. The real kicker. Shawn started his promotion, the Texas Wrestling Alliance, TWA, shortly before I moved to San Antonio. It was designed to give his trainees a place to put their instruction into practice, a place for us to be able to keep learning once we graduated and actually had to go out into the wrestling world. Along with the students, it was filled with experienced independent wrestlers from all over Texas. Originally, I was supposed to wrestle Lance in my first match, but due to an injury, they pulled Lance out the day before and put Bryan in his place, which made me feel a little more comfortable since he and I had trained so much together. Bryan had decided long before that he was going to wrestle under the name Spanky, which was in part a reference to masturbation, and with the gimmick, he didn't need to drive down to Mexico to get gear. He went to Goodwill, got some sort of flowery pajama bottoms, put on his amateur wrestling shoes, and voila, he had gear that was a great fit for the character. On October 4th, 1999, Bryan and I wrestled our first match in San Antonio at a country western bar called Far West Rodeo. Bryan came out dancing in his Goodwill PJs to Christina Aguilera's Genie in a Bottle, and I came out in my dragon mask and spandex tights with my lame music. In general, first matches are rotten, and ours were no different, though there's no denying we worked hard. We were trying to do a lot of stuff that you probably shouldn't be trying in your first match, like German suplexes and moonsaults. Though I had been nervous, after I got in the ring and started wrestling, I went into a weird state where I was just having fun. I'm not sure the 200 fans in attendance knew what to make of us, but they were very generous, cheering loudly after we wrestled to a 10-minute draw, maybe because we were wrestling a more action-packed style than they were used to seeing. We walked to the back afterward, and a bunch of the wrestlers congratulated us on our first match. Shawn in particular was thrilled with our performance. When I went to sleep that night, I couldn't believe I had done it. I'd wrestled my first match, it went well, and I didn't fall on my face. In November of that year, Shawn arranged for Lance and me to wrestle in Frontier Martial Arts Wrestling, FMW, a Japanese company, in exchange for his going over to referee a big match of theirs. Getting an opportunity to go to Japan so early in my career had me over the moon happy. We did a press conference with Shawn once we got to Japan, and then we went to FMW's big show to watch while Shawn refereed. I had seen a ton of Japanese wrestling, most of which was very technical and athletic, and I loved the style. FMW was a little different, though. It had some awesome technical wrestling and aerial moves, but it also had a lot of brawling and hardcore wrestling. This was not exactly typical in Japan, but with so many different wrestling companies, this happened to be FMW's niche. Their biggest star was a high-flying character named Hayabusa, who was wrestling Mr. Ganosuke in the match Shawn officiated. As we watched the promotional package, I couldn't believe it. To build up the match, Mr. Ganosuke had exploded a bottle rocket in Hayabusa's butt. That's right, he shoved the bottle rocket in Hayabusa's butt and lit it, and it exploded. Shawn's eyes were priceless when he first saw it. His brain seemed to explode. They assured Lance and me that there would be no fireworks put in our butts. After that show, Shawn flew back to San Antonio while we stayed. We did a week's worth of training at the FMW dojo with Masato Tanaka, a great wrestler we'd seen before in Extreme Championship Wrestling. Tanaka is a thick, muscular, and notoriously tough Japanese guy. Yet in my mind, I mostly remember this image of him as he left the dojo, hopping onto his little moped bike and saying, "Bye-bye," in an unexpectedly high-pitched voice. After our training, we commenced a 10-day tour, for which we were paid $1,000. Given how poor I was, it seemed like an incredible amount of money. I thought I'd never have to work again. Despite all my cultural confusion during my first trip to Japan, I had a great time. We wrestled 7 matches in 10 days, and Lance and I teamed up every show to wrestle 2 of the FMW guys. I learned something new every night from the Japanese wrestlers. The final 2 shows of the tour took place in Korakuen Hall, a small but legendary building in Tokyo where anybody who's anybody has wrestled. Wrestling in there was an amazing experience, and the crowds were awesome. They weren't necessarily excited to see either me or Lance, 2 young, green wrestlers that they barely knew, but they applauded when we did something good and were very forgiving when we weren't so good. The last match was my favorite of the tour. We faced off with 2 of the younger wrestlers, and for the first time, I did a springboard front somersault dive into the crowd, a move that would turn into a staple for me years later. At the end of the tour, they thanked us, gave us our money in cash, and told us they would love to have us back. Really, they only wanted Lance back, because even though neither of us was very good, Lance was big and had a cowboy gimmick that appealed to the Japanese audience. When he went back to FMW for a second tour without me, I realized the deal. At my size, if I wanted to be successful, I would need to get a whole lot better. In February 2000, a couple months after the Japan tour, Shawn got us an untelevised, or dark, tryout match with WWE at SmackDown in Austin. It was me and Shooter Schultz, another of Shawn's students, against Lance Cade and Brian Kendrick. The 4 of us went out there and threw everything we could at the match, to a mild reaction from the Austin crowd. We did a lot of things I now know we shouldn't have done. Lance performed a chokeslam, a move several people on the roster used, which would typically make that move off limits for anyone else to use. We also did several dives out of the ring, one of which gave me my first documented concussion. We weren't used to the ramp being there, and Lance took a misstep when he tried to catch me off my springboard somersault dive. I landed on my head on the ramp, which knocked me loopy. Afterward, the WWE doctor told me I had a concussion all right, but not much was known about concussions at the time, so he just advised the guys to make sure I didn't go to sleep after it. When we got back through the curtain, Shawn was there waiting, and he was all pumped up for us. "Yes, that was awesome," he said. He started telling anyone who would listen that they should sign us. Shawn is a great guy to have in your corner. Immediately following our tryout, he started putting pressure on WWE to sign us. Our tryout was on a Tuesday, and by Thursday, Shawn still hadn't heard anything. So he called and threatened to take us to WWE's rival wrestling promotion, WCW, since he was friends with Kevin Nash, who had a lot of influence there. That Friday, WWE offered all 4 of us, me, Brian, Lance, and Shooter, developmental contracts. Like I said, Shawn is a great guy to have in your corner. Our developmental contracts were for $500 per week, which made me feel like the richest guy in the world. The timing of the deal worked in my favor as well. The following week, I was doing my first ladder match, where Bryan and I wrestled against a team called the Board of Education for the TWA Tag Team title. It was the first time we were in the main event of a TWA show, so we wanted to pull out all the stops. At one point, I set up a 12-foot ladder in the ring and jumped off the second rung from the top, somersaulting over the top rope onto my opponent, Ruben Cruz, on the floor. The ladder moved as I jumped off, which didn't allow me to get enough distance to hit him. Ruben nearly sprinted forward to try to catch me, but it wasn't enough, and I landed hard on the floor, separating my right shoulder. We continued wrestling for another 10 minutes, which included me foolishly executing an elbow drop off the top of the ladder, which I'm sure didn't help matters. Bryan and I lost the match, but brawled with the Board of Education afterward, getting the upper hand and setting the two of them up on a table on the floor. Bryan and I dove off the top turnbuckle onto our opponents and crashed through the table. This was my first time through a table, and it was bad enough given the state of my shoulder, but as I went through, my head hit the leg of the metal guardrail, knocking me out for more than a full minute. I wasn't able to wrestle for the next 6 weeks, so I felt very lucky to have that guaranteed $500 a week. If it had happened a week sooner, my entire career would have been much different. That match changed my perspective on how I should wrestle. Due to my size, I thought I needed to wrestle a more daredevil style, but it wasn't practical because no matter how exciting the style might have been, if I kept getting hurt, I would have a pretty short career. I resolved to switch to a more mat-based wrestling style, since all of my injuries had occurred during big dives to the floor. I figured if I was going to have any longevity, I needed to be more grounded and technical, like Dean Malenko. That's why it was a godsend when WWE called and sent us to their developmental system in Memphis, Tennessee, where I first met William Regal. The follow-up to the ladder match with the Board of Education was a steel cage match that ultimately further reinforced my need to take fewer risks and make smarter decisions inside the ring. To make the cage match feel like the final definitive blow-off brawl between our teams, we decided that all 4 of us in the tag match would blade. In other words, purposely cut ourselves to draw blood. It was my first time, and I admit it was a terrifying prospect. Shawn showed us how to make a blade. You get a straight-edge razor and cut it to get one really sharp tip. You then affix that to your wrist tape so you can access it during the match. There are 2 methods for actually drawing blood. You can either stick it into your forehead and twist, or you can stick it into your forehead and slice. The smart way is to stick and twist. That's the way that leaves the least amount of scars. I've never been confident that that method would get me enough blood, so I've always been a slicer. I have a couple scars on my forehead today, so now I realize I probably should have learned the twist method instead. The most nerve-wracking part to me, though, was that I didn't know what to do with this incredibly sharp blade in my fingers once I was done. Shawn told me he'd usually stick it down his pants, or, to my utter shock, sometimes he'd stick it in his mouth. Neither of those sounded like a good place for this razor-sharp object. Preparing for the match, I had ripped my mask on the cage wall to provide easy access to my skin beneath it. When the time came, I readied myself, then stuck the blade into my forehead and scraped it across. It didn't hurt all that much, but what I did immediately notice was a very distinct sound, the sound of ripping. Instead of cramming it down my tights, which sounded crazy, I quickly handed the blade to the referee and instructed him to stick it in his pocket. Unfortunately, I only got one single drop of blood and nothing more than a scratch on my forehead. So I learned another valuable lesson that night for the future: have multiple razors on me. Though all 4 of us tried to blade in that match, the only person who actually got good blood was Brian Kendrick. Our failure and poor plan, frankly, just reflected the stupidity of being a rookie and trying to do things that weren't necessary. Like with anything else, you learn from experiences like this. Rock-and-Saki Connection. I am not a natural meat eater. When I was a child, my dad would go hunting and bring home big deer and elk, so we'd have a freezer full of deer and elk steak. My mom would always cook it for dinner, but I never really liked it. I think it was the texture, but it could have also been that I'd see my dad hanging the carcass at his friend's place. It was jarring to see the dead eyes of such beautiful creatures. I would shuffle the meat around on my plate in an attempt to make it look like I ate more than I did, then go after the green beans and mashed potatoes. Whenever it was up to me to make food for myself, I always went for things like peanut butter and jam sandwiches. I was a little spoiled in that regard because my mom always made homemade jam out of the raspberries in our garden, not to mention her homemade bread. As I started trying to learn about building muscle, I read the fitness magazines, all of which told me I needed a high-protein diet filled with meat. Chicken and tuna seemed to be their gospel, and it was preached in every magazine. I hadn't learned to question the media yet, so I just did my best to gulp it down. In 2004, when I met Austin Aries, I was surprised to learn he was a vegetarian. He was in great shape without eating any meat, and I really looked up to him for that. Separately, I switched from reading predominantly fiction books to predominantly nonfiction for the next several years, and all of a sudden, I had a growing awareness of the horrible condition animals were kept in within factory farms, as well as the substantial increase in carbon emitted in the production of meat as opposed to plants. I found that when you get deep into science and world problems, a lot of issues start running together. In 2007, inspired by Aries and the books I was reading, I tried going vegetarian. At first, I had a really hard time with this new diet, but the longer I did it, the better I felt. My diet also had implications for how people saw me. My first NXT match against Chris Jericho went really well, and when Chris got to the back, he expressed to Vince McMahon what a great job I'd done. As Chris tells it, Vince responded almost in disgust, grunting and then saying, "Him? He doesn't even eat meat." My family's reaction to me turning vegan was just as funny, especially with my dad being such a big hunter and meat eater. Still, they were supportive and did their best to make me food when I was back visiting. For my birthday, my mom even went through all the trouble to substitute vegan ingredients into her pumpkin cake, my favorite of all desserts. She didn't know much about veganism, but she tried to learn just for me. Despite the difficulties and frustration of finding food on the road, I felt the best I had in years. My diet was based on fresh fruit and vegetables, and I used things like beans, quinoa, and tofu for my protein. Soy was the predominant source of available protein on the road. I was constantly in search of places that had unprocessed veggie burgers, and most of them had a large quantity of soy in them. Unfortunately, a lot of soy is genetically modified, and shortly after WrestleMania in 2012, I started getting really sick again. I couldn't figure it out for a long time, but then we did a blood test and found out I had a severe intolerance to soy. When I was home and cooking my own food, avoiding soy was easy. Being on the road, however, was a different story. I tried going soy-free on the road for a while, but became more and more frustrated at all the vegan foods I could no longer eat, leaving me with no good alternatives for protein. I was drinking 4 or 5 vegan protein shakes a day, and the whole thing was driving me crazy. With a heavy heart, I made the decision to start adding some animal products back into my diet. It almost made me feel defeated, as if I had taken a stand but then failed. Work of art. Lance, Bryan, Shooter Schultz, and I moved to Memphis in mid-June 2000, almost 1 year to the exact day that I left Aberdeen for San Antonio. Moving to Memphis was a little nerve-wracking for all of us, mostly because we had never been outside Shawn's protective womb, as far as wrestling was concerned. We drove with Terry Golden, the promoter and owner of Memphis Championship Wrestling, MCW, which was the name of the developmental promotion. Terry was really nice to us, but it was a far cry from going to the shows with Shawn. The Raw in Nashville was the first time I met William Regal. Regal was an intimidating figure, particularly to someone like me who'd been wrestling less than a year. He's tall with a strong jawline, and he had a reputation for being a shooter, meaning he legitimately knew how to hurt you. Regal was in WWE's developmental system to prove he had kicked his pill dependency, which he is very frank and honest about in his book Walking a Golden Mile. I have only known Regal since he's been sober, so it's hard for me to imagine him as the wreck he was prior to getting clean. Before I met him, I had heard the stories, how he pissed on a flight attendant and shot on, that is, used legitimate moves or holds on, Bill Goldberg in a live TV match, which wasn't true. Being at MCW was Regal's opportunity to prove he could stay sober, and if he did, WWE would bring him back to TV. Not only did he stay sober, but Regal also ended up being the most influential person in my career. The William Regal I met was nothing like the man I'd heard stories about. He was soft-spoken and funny, and he had a genuine interest in helping anyone who wanted to be helped. Regal took to Bryan and me right away when he saw how eager we were to learn. He introduced us to the European style of wrestling, which was heavily based on submission holds, counters, and advanced mat-based wrestling. Something I had never seen before, particularly as it became increasingly more difficult to find European wrestling videotapes would work in a US VCR. Since I was trying to switch to a less risky style, Regal was the perfect teacher for me. He would go into detail explaining the finer points of basic holds and why certain counters make sense and others don't, given the intuitive visual intelligence people have about the human body. He opened up a whole new world of wrestlers like Johnny Saint and Mark Rollerball Rocco, who were great wrestlers, and the way Regal thought and talked about wrestling transformed the way I thought and talked about it. It made sense to me. However, as eager as Bryan and I were to learn the European style, a lot of the other guys were not so keen on it. In the fast-paced, live TV style of WWE, some saw the mat wrestling encounters as slow and relatively boring. They weren't interested in the specifics of wrist lock counters, nor were they receptive to Regal's broader ideas that wrestling should make sense. Unfortunately for us, Regal got called back up to WWE television not long after we arrived in Memphis. He had been there a year and had not only stayed sober, but was performing on a whole other level. Regal had a match with Chris Benoit at that year's Brian Pillman Memorial Show that blew my mind. It was a perfect example of how aggressive mat wrestling could work in the modern wrestling environment. After I saw it, I thought, holy shit, that's the kind of wrestling I need to be doing. Even though we were only in Memphis a couple of months together, Regal became my mentor, and he has remained my mentor ever since. He's the person I go to for advice to this day. The MCW shows we ran usually had very small crowds. We did a Wednesday night show every week in Oxford, Mississippi, at a bar where people didn't even have to pay to see us. The 45 people who were usually in attendance were there mostly to drink, and in between swallows, they'd watch the show and heckle us. MCW taped television shows as well. Initially, we filmed at a really cool spot on Beale Street, but that didn't last very long. Soon, we were filming anywhere that would let us, like at armories and half-empty high school gyms. By the end of MCW, we were doing shows at gas stations and random places like that. My favorite place we did television was in a Walmart parking lot, where shopping carts doubled as a guardrail, and we all made our entrance out of the RV we all dressed in. This created a semi-comical scenario where bad guys were running out of the RV to attack a good guy. More good guys came out of the same RV to chase the bad guys back to the RV, and then the good guys walked back to the same RV moments later. Another real demoralizer for most of the guys was that very few people were being brought up to the main roster from Memphis. It didn't bother me too much because I'd never really gotten my hopes up that I would be brought up anytime soon. The only time my getting called up to TV was alluded to by WWE was around Royal Rumble 2001, when we were told WWE was looking to start a new cruiserweight division like the one that was popular in WCW. Bryan and I were told they wanted to use us for it. Of course, that never happened. There were certainly good moments as well. In February 2001, WWE renewed all 4 of our contracts for another year, and I was able to save some money. I earned enough to buy a 2000 Ford Focus and replace my old car, which was breaking down. I didn't have enough to pay for it in cash, so I had to make payments, which turned out to be a big mistake given what would happen a few months later in June. I also bought my first bed after more than a year and a half of sleeping on floors and inflatable mattresses. When I got a bed and a car, I felt like I was living a life of luxury. In June 2001, shortly after WWE had bought WCW, we went to the training center for what we thought was another normal day. When we walked in, we could tell something was up. Terry introduced a guy I didn't know from WWE's Talent Relations Department, and they let us know they were closing down the developmental territory in Memphis. We were told some of us would be sent to other developmental territories in Cincinnati or Louisville, but unfortunately, some of us would be fired. They were going to let us know our fate one by one as they called us into the office. I went in third. Of the 2 guys who went before me, one was fired and one was sent to Cincinnati. When I walked in, I knew the score. The man said that although they thought I was very talented, they didn't have any current plans for me and they were going to let me go. Some of the guys who ended up getting fired got angry and threw stuff all over. I was just devastated, left with no idea what to do next. Under our contracts, if you were fired, you'd still be paid for 90 days. But in order for us to get our money, we had to stay in Memphis and continue working the remainder of the MCW shows. Morale was understandably low, and these shows were the worst I had ever been a part of. Even the guys who were kept on and being sent somewhere else couldn't be excited or in a good mood, because half of the locker room had been fired. There was a lot of backstage drinking, and probably some other stuff I wasn't aware of, and ultimately Memphis went out with a whimper. The last show we had scheduled was in a parking lot of a pawn shop. We were getting changed in the store's restroom when all of a sudden it started raining. Terry decided to just cancel the show. We all went out, loaded up the ring in the rain, and took a group picture in front of the trailer. So ended Memphis Championship Wrestling. Although I was very, very depressed after getting fired, I was also very fortunate for the opportunities I received while under contract. Former WWE superstar Charlie Haas and his brother Russ were really close with Jim Kettner, a top independent promoter out of Delaware who ran the East Coast Wrestling Association, ECWA. In 1997, Jim created an increasingly popular annual tournament he called the Super 8, featuring the 8 best independent wrestlers from around the country. When the Haas brothers came down to Memphis and saw Bryan and me wrestle, they told Jim they thought we'd be great for the Super 8. Charlie suggested that I would be the perfect opponent for Low-Key, who was tearing up the Northeast indie wrestling scene and was Kettner's top prospect. When he called and asked me to participate, I gladly accepted. Kettner often worked with WWE to promote live events in Delaware and had a good relationship with the organization. He promised WWE, and me as well, that he would put me in matches where I would have the chance to shine, and boy did he. In the first round, I wrestled Bryan. In the second, I wrestled Reckless Youth, who was gone from WWE by this point. And in the finals, it came down to me against Low-Key. All 3 of my matches went really well, and the Low-Key match, specifically, got a great reaction. Not just because it was the finals, but because we were blending hard-nosed mat wrestling with stiff kicks and chops in a way that American independent fans weren't used to. The Super 8 received a great deal of coverage, including in national magazines like Pro Wrestling Illustrated, so I got a lot of good publicity out of it. Honestly, if I had not competed in the tournament, I would have had a difficult time securing bookings once I was fired, since before the Super 8, nobody really knew me outside of San Antonio and Memphis. After I got fired from WWE's developmental system, I moved back to Washington, pretty much what I've done nearly every time I don't know what to do. I went back to living with my mom and tried to come up with a new game plan. I got a big break in October 2001 thanks to Roland Alexander, a promoter out of California who ran All Pro Wrestling, APW. The prior year, he'd organized a tournament called King of the Indies. Based out of the Bay Area himself, Roland used almost exclusively West Coast wrestlers in his first 8-man tournament. The following year, he decided to do something a little different by making it a 2-night, 16-man tournament, bringing in wrestlers from all over the country as well as Doug Williams from England. Based on our performances in the Super 8, Roland offered Bryan and me a spot each in his elite tournament. On the first day, Roland matched me up with Bryan for the opening round. Since we'd wrestled each other over 100 times by then, we had a really good match that caught the attention of one ring legend in particular. Nick Bockwinkel, who was among several other legendary wrestlers presiding over the show, approached Roland at the end of the first night. "If you don't put that guy over," Bockwinkel said, pointing directly at me as he suggested I win, "you're crazy." Though it certainly was not the original plan, Roland took his advice, a decision that created a lot of drama and controversy the following day. Initially, Donovan Morgan, who was the head trainer at the All Pro Wrestling School, the promotion's true moneymaker, was scheduled to beat me in the semifinals, then go on to win the tournament. He was red hot about the switch, but that wasn't the only thing he was angry about. On the morning of the second day of the tournament, Roland, immensely impressed with our performances the previous night, offered me and Bryan roles as trainers at the APW school. He explained that he needed a new head trainer because Donovan was spending a great deal of time wrestling in Japan. Even though the 2 of us were relatively inexperienced, Roland said, he believed we would be great trainers. We told him we'd think about it, then went and asked Donovan how the job was, not knowing, of course, that Roland hadn't told him about the proposition. Donovan was furious, though at Roland, not at us. That night, I wrestled Doug Williams, which was fun because he knew how to do all the European-style wrestling that Regal had taught me. The momentum shifted later on in the semifinals, where I wrestled Donovan. Feeling betrayed and discouraged, he didn't really get into our match or want to do much of anything to make it a memorable performance, which was understandable. It was a short, lackluster match, unlike my final round encounter with Low-Key, which was essentially a rematch from the Super 8 finals. We wrestled for nearly 30 minutes, incorporating the same elements that made our previous match unique. I won with a submission move I started using at the Super 8 as my finish, the cattle mutilation, a bridging double chicken wing with my opponent on his stomach. This move became my calling card for the rest of my time on the independents. Recognizing that a former vegan's use of something called cattle mutilation may be a bit unexpected, I figured the origin of the move's name might need some explanation. I first saw the hold at a National Wrestling Alliance (NWA) show called Future Shock '89, a round-robin tournament among the top NWA stars of that time, including the Great Muta, who was one of the most exciting wrestlers of that period. All of a sudden, in the middle of a match, Muta pulled out this bridging double chicken wing. It got no reaction and was barely mentioned by the commentators, but I thought it was awesome. I started using it when I was in Memphis, though only a few times as a finish. When I did use it, I called it a bridging double chicken wing thing. The first time I heard the words cattle mutilation was when I wrestled Reckless Youth in the Super 8. I told him I'd like to beat him with a full Nelson suplex, but given I'd just beaten Brian Kendrick with that submission in the previous round, he told me he thought I should also beat him with cattle mutilation. I had no idea what he was talking about. Cattle mutilation, he said. That's what that submission is called. He looked at me like I was a dummy and walked off. I took his advice for the finish, but thought the name was wacky and assumed I'd never hear it again. Shortly thereafter, however, when I wrestled Christopher Daniels, he called it cattle mutilation as well. By the time Ring of Honor, ROH, started, everyone called it that. Everyone, that is, except me. I had no idea where the name had come from and hated the imagery, so I stubbornly continued to call it my bridging double chicken wing thing. It wasn't until late 2002 that I finally accepted that the move would always be known as cattle mutilation, despite my greatest efforts. Such is life. Immediately following my victory in the King of Indies tournament, I was presented with this huge trophy, which I actually got to keep, unlike other wrestling trophies, which are usually just for show and taken back shortly after they're given to you. But more important than the trophy was that this positioned me as a main event wrestler on the independents. That 2-day APW tournament on October 26th and 27th was the inspiration for Ring of Honor, and my win made people see me as a top guy right away, including the people responsible for ROH when it came to be. After the tournament, Brian and I weren't sure what to do about the APW trainer roles. If nothing else, we were both broke and could use the money. Despite the opportunity, Brian decided not to take it. Before I could decide, I made an important phone call to Donovan to ask if it would be okay with him if I did take the job. He said he was fine with it and encouraged me to do it because it would be a good experience for me. Whether he meant that or not, I have no idea, but the next day I called Roland to tell him I was interested. I would be earning $350 a week and given a place to stay. Plus, my weekends would be free to take independent bookings. I was sold. When I moved down to train at APW, I really had no idea what to expect. Roland gave me the address for where I'd be living, and when I arrived, the house I pulled up to was nice and in a great neighborhood. What I didn't realize was that I would be living with Roland himself, as well as another promoter named Doug Anderson, who was the father of one of the girls in the training program, cheerleader Melissa. Also in the house was Roland's 88-year-old uncle Al. We were quite the household. I had a small room on the second floor of the house, and sure enough, I was back to sleeping on the floor. For a while, the APW wrestling school was immensely profitable, by independent standards, that is. Roland and All Pro Wrestling received tremendous exposure after being heavily featured in the wrestling documentary Beyond the Mat, in which 2 APW trainees received WWE tryouts. After the film came out and garnered some success, Roland was able to charge much higher rates. Whereas I paid $3,900 to train with Shawn Michaels, Roland was able to charge $6,000 per student. Not only that, but he signed new trainees to contracts that required them to pay their complete balance even if they quit. Each class was limited to 20 students, and before I got there, almost all the classes were full. Their strategy seemed to me to be to work the students to death the first several weeks, so that only those who really wanted it would stay. The quitters would forfeit some of their tuition, which didn't seem right to me. By the time I moved to Fremont, Donovan Morgan and Mike Modest, another one of Roland's former trainers, had opened up a school and promotion called Pro Wrestling Iron in the same area to compete with APW. The rival organization would bash Roland's APW on internet message boards, which led those in APW to do the same about Pro Wrestling Iron. The increased competition created a sharp decline in students for All Pro Wrestling, though that wasn't the only contributing factor. I wasn't only in charge of training, but also recruitment. I was responsible for contacting anyone from nearby and all over the world who filled out enrollment applications. And Roland didn't just want me to call them once. He wanted me to call them at least every month for a full year. Donovan had done that, and his ability to call people and sell them on the school was one of the reasons APW was so successful. I, on the other hand, was less good at it. Roland asked me to spend 30 minutes to an hour each training day calling prospective students. I did it at first, but it just wasn't in me to try to sell people on becoming a wrestler, especially when I knew the price tag. I've always thought that if someone really wanted to wrestle, they'd do it and not need to be sold on anything. That is why I'm a horrible businessman. To be honest, I wasn't that much better at training people to wrestle. I was actually quite good at breaking down the movements of wrestling, but I was bad at motivation. I never needed anyone else to motivate me to work hard at wrestling, to watch tapes, or to try new things. All of that was fun for me, so it didn't ever seem like work. The only student I taught who really succeeded was Sarah Amato, who has traveled all over the world wrestling and today is an accomplished trainer for future divas down at the WWE Performance Center. Prior to my arrival at APW, Sarah had already been training with Donovan, but she injured her knee, so she was essentially starting from scratch when I got there. She worked really hard, she was constantly studying tapes, and in general, she was tough. One time I was teaching back body drops, and the girl she was in the ring with collapsed under her, causing Sarah to land on her shoulder and separate it. She let out an expletive, rolled out of the ring, popped her own shoulder back into place, then got back into the ring to do it again. Another reason I was a bad trainer. I let her try to do it again. She took the back body drop a second time, and when she landed, her shoulder popped out again. Once more, she cursed, rolled out, popped it back in, and was ready to get back inside the ring. At that point, I stepped in and told her she was done for the day, and then I instructed her to go see a doctor. Even though Sarah wasn't making the wisest decision to fight through an injury like that, it demonstrated her passion for wrestling. When people ask me what it takes to be a wrestler, I always say passion is the most important thing. Well, passion and luck. All of that said, I truly enjoyed training people. Teaching forces you to learn your craft better in order to explain it to other people. At that point in my career, still being so new to wrestling, it helped me a great deal. Plus, I really enjoyed the Bay Area, and despite my doubts about the living situation, it turned out to be fun. Roland, who passed away in 2013, was witty and funny, and he always had something interesting to talk about, mostly wrestling gossip. Doug Anderson was a kind man who always seemed to be in good spirits. Living with Roland's 88-year-old uncle was what made the situation truly unique. On Uncle Al's 89th birthday, we decided to throw him a surprise party, complete with an ice cream cake and tons of decorations. As Roland and I went through the party supply store, Roland grabbed 2 candles, one that was an 8 and another that was a 9. I stopped him and pointed out how rare it is that people live to be 89. Roland agreed with my suggestion to celebrate with 89 candles. It was just a matter of regular candles or magic candles, the kind that don't blow out. Without really thinking things through, we chose the latter. After training, we invited all the students over to the house for Uncle Al's big birthday bash. We got everybody party favors like hats and kazoos, and had even found a bunch of paper Batman masks because we thought they were funny and would confuse Uncle Al. Training ran late, so we all got back to the house around 9 p.m., which is about 2 hours later than Uncle Al's usual bedtime. Since he couldn't hear very well, the noise of all of us coming in didn't wake him up. We quickly set up all the decorations and got to work on the ice cream cake, which we planned on bringing into his bedroom. Not one person, not even Doug, who is a sensible, responsible adult, brought up that it might be a bad idea to put 89 candles that don't blow out onto an ice cream cake. We organized all the candles on the cake, which required us to put them very close together. We were less than halfway through when the candles all caught on fire and created an inferno, so high that it left black marks on the ceiling. Of course, what do we all do? We start trying to blow them out, which didn't work because they were magic fucking candles. I grabbed the cake and tried running it to the kitchen sink to put the fire out with water, while Roland went to wake up Uncle Al so he could see the mess we created. The kitchen faucet didn't work, so as I ran outside, I dropped the cake on the floor. By this point, Uncle Al, dressed only in his boxer shorts and a white tank top, was ever so slowly coming out of his room, yelling, "What the hell is going on?" Sarah ran to get a knife and a plate. We cut a piece of the salvaged cake and lit one candle on it, and when Uncle Al emerged, we gave him the cake as we all sang happy birthday. Unexpectedly, Uncle Al started crying. In nearly 9 decades, it was the first birthday party he ever had. Carpet Diem. After I was fired by WWE in 2001, my main goal was to get back to Japan and become a regular competitor there. That was actually my ideal situation when I started wrestling, thinking that American wrestlers who could make a living wrestling in Japan had it the best. In my mind, they could go there, do what they love, and then, when they came back to the States, they could walk around unmolested, without having to deal with the hassles of being mildly famous. The head of WWE Talent Relations at the time was John Laurinaitis, who had a long history of working with All Japan Pro Wrestling, and shortly after my developmental contract was terminated, he told me he'd try to get me in there. Regal also gave me the number of Brad Rangans, an older Minnesota wrestler who had the ability to get guys into the other top promotion of the Far East, New Japan Pro Wrestling. Unfortunately, neither of them was able to get me in, and both eventually stopped returning my phone calls. That all said, I jumped at the opportunity when I was invited to a New Japan tryout in Santa Monica in March of 2002. The day before the tryout, Roland had flown several of the APW talent, including me, to Las Vegas to attend the Cauliflower Alley Club, CAC, an annual reunion dinner for retired and active wrestlers. We arrived the day before so Roland could network and several of the APW wrestlers could appear on the CAC's Future Legends show, the assumption being that it could get some influential eyes on us. I only remember one thing from that Cauliflower Alley show. I was wrestling Brian Kendrick on the show, and beforehand we were talking backstage. Brian turned and saw a skinny young wrestler doing a stretch on his back while kicking his legs over his head and leaving them there. Brian walked up to the kid, whom we'd never met before, and casually said, "Hey, you know that's the best way to suck your own cock, right?" The kid was terrified as he watched Brian get down on the ground next to him and demonstrate the motions. With that, Nick Bockwinkel, a wrestling legend and the man responsible for my winning the King of the Indies tournament, entered the room, dressed to perfection. Brian didn't see him come in, so Bockwinkel saw the entire demonstration, as Brian told the kid to just let gravity do all the work. Brian looked up just in time to see an appalled Bockwinkel shake his head in disgust and walk out of the room. I nearly fell over laughing. After the CAC event, we drove from Las Vegas to Los Angeles, staying with Brian's friend Jordan, who had a Foreman grill with ants that he refused to kill, treading all over it. Brian and I had to be at the tryout at 10 a.m., so we woke up early the next morning and headed to Santa Monica. The Inoki Dojo was in a large warehouse, and it was the nicest wrestling training center I had ever seen at that point. It was huge. They had amateur wrestling mats on the floor, kickboxing bags, nice lifting equipment, and the coolest thing, an official New Japan Pro Wrestling ring. There were TV cameras and film crews on hand, with the intent of airing some of the footage on Japanese television. Seeing the whole production was exciting, even more so because Antonio Inoki himself, a WWE Hall of Famer and the founder of New Japan, was there to watch and evaluate us. Or so we thought. There were around 15 mostly local independent guys there for the tryout, and we all ran through a series of calisthenics to warm up, followed by a match. Brian and I wrestled each other in the first match, doing our best to impress and busting out our coolest stuff. In the middle of the match, Brian muttered to me, "That motherfucker's not even watching. Look at him." I managed to look over, only to see Inoki holding onto this giant stick, doing what is apparently one of his signature exercises while watching MMA fighter Don Fry on one of the mats. Inoki literally had his back to us to watch Don Fry stretch. When Brian and I finished our match, all the other wrestlers on the outside clapped. We then took our turn at ringside to see the other exhibition matches, and noticed that Inoki didn't watch a single one of them. It turns out they weren't truly interested in scouting or assessing talent at all. They really just wanted the dojo to look full in front of the Japanese cameras. I was bothered we'd wasted our time, but Brian was especially irate. After the tryout, Christopher Daniels and I were sitting on a couch in the dojo, while Brian stood talking to us. Inoki was fooling around over on the cable crossover machine, which actually wasn't fully assembled. It just looked like it was. When Inoki jumped up on the beam to do a pull-up, the whole thing came crashing down on him, weights and all. Everybody rushed over to help him except for the three of us. Daniels and I remained seated on the couch, and as more people scurried over, Brian loudly said, "Serves that motherfucker right." Despite my disappointing first experience there, every time the Inoki Dojo told me there was an opportunity for a tryout, I made the trip down. It was a 6-hour drive from Fremont to Santa Monica, and the tryouts were always in the morning. I'd drive down at night after I finished training at APW, then find some place to park and sleep in my car until the call time. None of the subsequent trips down were as bad as the first, possibly because I made sure not to expect much. Even if there was just a minute chance it would lead to an opportunity in Japan, I had to take the chance. My whole perspective on how I approached the dojo changed when I went there in August 2002 and met a New Japan wrestler named Shinya Togi Makabe, who was running the workout. I performed pretty well that day, and at the end of the session, he spoke with every athlete there through an interpreter. "You can't come down for just one day and expect to go to New Japan," he said, before pointing at Rocky Romero, TJ Perkins, and Ricky Reyes. "These guys are here every single day. They show their determination, they work hard. And if you want to be successful, you need to work just as hard." Those words really resonated with me. I was working hard up in Fremont, but nobody was seeing that hard work. At that point, I knew what I needed to do. When I got back to Fremont, I told Roland we needed to talk. I explained that, although I was thankful for the opportunity he gave me, for my career to move forward, I thought I needed to move down to Santa Monica and train at the Inoki Dojo full-time. I expected Roland to be angry, or at least disappointed, but he wasn't. I think thrilled would be too strong of a word, but he was definitely relieved. I hadn't been able to bring in many new students to the school, and even though Roland wasn't paying me tons of money, it was enough that it was putting stress on his finances. He thought it was a great idea for both of us. So in early September, I packed my stuff back in my car and moved down to Santa Monica. Training there was awesome. At first, Shinya Makabe, whose advice persuaded me to make the move, was our trainer, and he taught us the New Japan way of doing things. Once he left, an MMA fighter named Justin McCulley guided us through practices, mixing up pro wrestling stuff with jiu-jitsu and kickboxing. It was a fun place to be, and we worked hard. Much to my surprise, I was offered a 3-week tour with New Japan in October, only a month after I started training there full-time, joining Ricky Reyes and Rocky Romero, who teamed together as the Havana Pitbulls. I was thrilled. The tour was incredible. New Japan was the biggest wrestling company in Japan at the time, and we wrestled in front of at least 1,000 people every night. The highlight, however, was my first time wrestling in the Tokyo Dome. The Tokyo Dome is huge. At its capacity, it can hold over 60,000 people for a wrestling show. When I first walked inside, I was amazed. The dome-shaped roof is an air-supported structure, held up by pressurizing the inside of the building. When we came in, we walked into a vault-like room. They closed the door we came through, at which point I could feel the pressure change. Then, they opened another large door to enter the stadium. All of that was done to stabilize the pressure and keep the roof what I call inflated. To me, the building was a feat of modern engineering. In a show called The Spiral on October 14th, I teamed with the Pitbulls against Masahito Kakihara, Tiger Mask, and one of my all-time favorite wrestlers, Jushin Thunder Liger. Around the time when I was in high school, Liger had come to the United States and wrestled for WCW multiple times, including one high-profile match with Brian Pillman that was incredible for its time. Shortly before our match, referee Tayama, who spoke great English and was always there to help us out, jokingly gave us some advice. Don't look at the crowd when you walk down the ramp. I could understand why. The ramp down to the ring at the Tokyo Dome was long, maybe 100 yards, and it was intimidating for 3 guys who'd never wrestled in front of a crowd anywhere close to its size. They had a golf cart take us to the staging area where we would make our entrance. All 3 of us were giddy as schoolgirls, not to mention a little nervous. Yet when we walked out, I couldn't help but look out to the crowd. There were over 30,000 people in attendance, and though probably less than 10% of the audience had even heard of the 3 of us, it didn't matter. I was mesmerized, and lucky I made it down to the ring without tripping over my feet. I remember nothing from the match, only that I had a hard time keeping a smile off my face throughout it. A short time later, I ended up living in the dojo and would make several more trips to Japan. Though I had previously been completely focused on wrestling, living at the Inoki Dojo forced me to be surrounded by wrestling all the time. There was no escape. Sometimes it was suffocating, but it was undoubtedly good for my development. The Inoki ideal of infusing pro wrestling with legitimate martial arts opened up my eyes to all that was possible with the form, and as a result, I was performing better than ever. In April 2003 in ROH, I wrestled in what, up to that point in time, was the best match of my career. It was against Paul London, who, though relatively new to ROH, was loved by fans because of his charisma, his ability to sell being hurt, and his daredevil style of wrestling. Paul had trained with Rudy Boy Gonzalez down in San Antonio, and we discovered we had instant chemistry the first time we wrestled a number of months before. That initial match we had was relatively short, under 15 minutes, but the fans enjoyed it, and Gabe booked the rematch to be a 2 out of 3 falls match. Both Shawn Michaels and William Regal tried to instill in me the idea that more so than moves, storytelling was the most important thing in a match. Though I tried to learn as many techniques as I could over the years, I also always focused on different ways of telling stories. Our rematch went over 40 minutes, and it was not only the longest match I'd ever had, but also the first time I really felt like I nailed telling a story in a match. I didn't wrestle another match in ROH for 7 months, and that was the perfect way to leave. Unlike Frontier Martial Arts Wrestling a few years earlier, when New Japan told me they were interested in bringing me back over, they actually did. I joined them for 2 more tours in the beginning of 2003. The initial series of shows in March was relatively uneventful, though while on tour, I met TJ Wilson, now Tyson Kidd, for the first time, and I rejoined Scott Norton, who had been on my inaugural tour of New Japan in 2002. Scott, an enormous world champion arm wrestler, was a great guy to be around. Given he'd been a New Japan regular since 1990, he taught us a lot of tricks about surviving in Japan. He showed us how to get to gyms independently, showed us some great restaurants near our regular hotels, and informed us about New Japan's inner workings, politically speaking. Scott joked that if I had come to New Japan 4 or 5 years earlier, he and the other guys would have forced me to drink. Fortunately, there was far less pressure for a teetotaler like me, because Scott was the veteran gaijin, which the Japanese called all of us foreigners, wrestler, and he had stopped drinking entirely himself. He said to me, "Kid, I can't make you drink, but I can make you drink this." With that, he bought me my first cup of coffee. I was wired for hours. In May, I went abroad for another short tour of only 2 or 3 shows, one of which was at the Tokyo Dome again. This time, instead of being on the main show, we were on a show the day before that had only 3 matches and was also in the middle of a pachinko tournament, which was a form of Japanese gambling I never quite understood. The setup for our show was memorably weird. Outside the ring, there were a few hundred chairs, but there were also a ton of pachinko machines, which took up roughly the space of the size of a high school gym, all right in the center of the gigantic Tokyo Dome. That night, TJ Perkins wrestled first, and then Rocky Romero and I teamed up against Masahito Kakihara and Akira, and I'll admit that wrestling in a stadium that large with so few people felt strange. I almost would have preferred wrestling in the Walmart parking lot from the Memphis days. The match didn't light the world on fire, but it was good considering Kakihara and Akira put forth so little effort. Our opponents didn't seem to even want to be there, like it was a demotion for them to be wrestling on this show the day before the real big show. Now, having experienced so much more in my own career, I completely sympathize with them. When we got back to the hotel, Justin McCauley had us meet him in his room. The 3 of us, me, Rocky, and TJ, stood there as Justin told us how disappointed Antonio Inoki was in the match. Then, he slapped us. Each of us. If that happened to me today, I would instantly punch him in the face, which would surely have ended with me getting my ass kicked, since even at that time Justin had already fought at UFC, the Ultimate Fighting Championship, and was a heavyweight. I was confused and wasn't quite sure what I had done that was so wrong that I deserved to be slapped. Justin explained that the slap was from Inoki, because he thought we should have done more of the shoot fighting style we practiced at the dojo. According to him, Inoki understood that it was difficult, because our opponents were the veterans, and in wrestling you're taught to listen to the people that have more experience than you, but the slaps were to inspire us to challenge the system. The intent was to transfer his fighting spirit to us, a common custom in his dojo. People lined up to be slapped by Inoki, and the Japanese culture. Truthfully, he could have just said it instead of slapping us, and it would have been every bit as effective. After the debacle at the Tokyo Dome, instead of flying back to Los Angeles with the rest of the guys, I flew to London for an opportunity to work for longtime English promoter Brian Dixon. For a while, Regal had been pushing Dixon to bring me over, but Brian preferred using bigger Americans because they made such great villains. Plus, with English wrestlers typically being on the smaller side, it would automatically put them in an underdog role that the fans could get behind. I was obviously not very big, and though I developed a reputation as a good wrestler, I wasn't a great character that would appeal to Dixon's fan base. Finally, Dixon agreed to give me a chance to perform for his company, All Star Wrestling. After landing in England, I had to go through immigration before I could get my bags. The immigration officer asked me what I was doing there, and as instructed by Dixon, I said, "Oh, just visiting friends." "What friends?" he asked. Immediately I started getting nervous because I wasn't a very good liar. I gave him Brian Dixon's name. After he requested his contact information, I supplied his phone number too. "How long are you staying?" he asked. "A couple months." "Do you have a return ticket?" Not yet, I was going to get one. How much money do you have on you? About $400. This caught his attention right away. So what are you going to do for money for the couple months you are here? Clearly $400 would not be enough. Had I been a better liar, I could have easily made up something, like I would have money transferred over when I was running low. Instead, I struggled to come up with an answer, and by this point I was sweating. The immigration officer could tell. He brought another officer over and they questioned me further. During the interrogation, they got my bag from baggage claim, and as they looked through it, they found my wrestling gear. They asked what I was doing in Japan, and I told them. And you're sure you're not here to wrestle? They inquired. Nope, I said, just here to visit. Even though I could tell things weren't going well, I was going to stick to my story. They must have done some research on Dixon and figured out that he was a wrestling promoter. They called Dixon to ask if he knew me. At first, he kept with the story that I was just in England to visit, but at some point, he changed his tune and stooged me off. When the officer came back, he said, just so you know, we're going to deport you. Your friend told us you were going to work as a personal trainer. They stuck me in a room with a bunch of other people getting deported, and I was the only American. They were all looking at me, thinking I must have done something really bad if I was an American getting deported. That wasn't really the case. I was just a 21-year-old without much of a game plan. To make matters a little more stressful, I learned that when they deport you, they don't deport you back to your home country. They deport you back to the country from which you came. They were going to deport me back to Japan. I would have to buy my own ticket back to the States if that's where I wanted to go. They let me call my mom, and after I told her the situation, she and my sister started researching all the flight options on the internet. Everything they could find would cost thousands of dollars to get me back to the United States within the time I had, and I wasn't allowed to leave the airport. Flying back to Japan and then getting to the States from there wasn't any cheaper, and was really a long way to travel. I was starting to get desperate when I spoke with an agent for British Airways. The whole time we had been looking for a one-way ticket. She decided to search for a round-trip ticket and found one that wasn't available online, direct from Heathrow to LAX for only $500. I couldn't believe how lucky I was. Shortly after I got back to the States, I got in touch with Brian Dixon. He told me if I still wanted to come wrestle in England, I could, and this time he would get me a work permit. I could tell he felt bad about the whole thing, especially because he knew I had a close relationship with Regal. I had purchased a round-trip ticket, so I still had the return flight, and since I didn't have any shows booked because I had planned on being in England this whole time anyhow, I told him I would come. I drove my car back to Aberdeen from Santa Monica. I didn't know how long I would stay in England, let alone anticipate a full 6-month stay, then flew back across the Atlantic that May. My first day in England was interesting. I had flown into Heathrow Airport and had a show that same night. Brian told me the name of the building and the address, but I was left to my own devices to actually get there. The show was at Fairfield Halls in Croydon, which is near London. I had no idea how to get there and had no clue how to use the English transportation system. I'd never lived in a place where the public transportation infrastructure was good enough to be useful. If not for the kindness of the random strangers I was asking for directions, I might still be lurking around London today. When I finally got to Fairfield Halls around 4:30 p.m., I found out Brian had told them I'd be there early, and they had a quiet room with a small bed upstairs for me to take a nap. I fell fast asleep and didn't wake up until I heard a knock on the door around 7 p.m. With very little time before showtime, I got a little flustered. In a rush, I got downstairs and walked around introducing myself. I was saying hellos and shaking hands when I noticed 3 guys sort of huddled together. Guy number 1 was holding guy number 2, while guy number 3 was slapping him. It looked to me like they were just fooling around, so I kept shaking hands, laughed at the scene, and then walked out into the next room. That night, I went on to win the tournament and the middleweight championship. The coolest part was being presented the title by Mark Rocco, who is famous for being the original Black Tiger in Japan. Rocco was also part of a small group of guys who revolutionized wrestling in the late 70s and early 80s by creating a hybrid of Mexican, Japanese, and English ring styles. If you go back and watch Rocco's matches from that time period, they're still exciting today. What was unusual about the night, however, was that during the entire show, people kept apologizing to me. I had no idea why. I thought it was because I had to do 3 matches right after taking that long flight. "Sorry, Brian, this sort of thing never happens here," someone would say. "No worries, this happens all the time in the United States," I'd respond and go on my merry way. I later found out they weren't talking about the 3 matches. After the show, I rode with a referee named Mal to the next town, and he apologized to me again. I explained to him that wrestling multiple matches was no big deal to me since tournaments like this were very popular in the United States, and I usually ended up competing in a tournament almost every month somewhere. He stared at me confusedly. Then he realized I didn't know what had happened. He explained that the three huddled guys I thought were fooling around earlier in the locker room weren't. It turns out that guy number 1 and guy number 3, relatives of a current WWE diva, were really beating up guy number 2. My understanding is they threatened to throw him out of the window of the locker room, which was 4 stories up. Fortunately, they didn't. My response was simple. Holy shit, how did I miss that? Thus ended my first day in England. Summer is the busiest time of year for Dixon and All-Star Wrestling, which is why I went out when I did. My first show was what they refer to as a town show, a normal show in front of wrestling fans. But during summer months, most of Dixon's events take place at Butlins. Butlins, which is what the English call a holiday camp, is a chain of inexpensive seaside resorts with beaches for families who pay an all-inclusive fee for lodging and entertainment. Food is extra. These resorts have music acts, magic shows, and all sorts of entertainment, including wrestling. As a result, most of the people who watch the shows aren't actually wrestling fans. They just happen to be there, and wrestling is a fun novelty. We'd wrestle at the 3 Butlins locations, Bognor Regis, Skegness, and my favorite, Minehead, twice each, every week. We'd typically do Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, hitting a different Butlins location each day. Then we'd go back on Saturday and Sunday, sometimes doing a double shot on Saturday, performing at 2 different locations in the same day. Every week I wrestled the minimum of 5 shows, oftentimes more because there would be town shows and other holiday camp shows thrown in along the way. Dixon wanted me wearing my mask again, which was great because it instantly made me more of a character. Though I was originally a good guy at town shows, the theme for the Butlins shows was England versus the United States, with the Americans being the villains. Being the American Dragon, it was clear which side I fell on. I'd carry the US flag to the ring, and at first I just did typical bad guy stuff from 80s wrestling. I soon started to really enjoy myself and get creative. My voice has never been good, but I made it even worse for the act by coming to the ring and singing the American national anthem. I even intentionally forgot words to further rile up the crowd, and eventually added to the mix cutting promos on the microphone prior to singing, which helped me get a little more comfortable on one of my other biggest weaknesses. In the ring, I alternated between trying to be a ruthless villain and trying to make people laugh, often in the same match. I'd regularly try to find as many unique ways to get hit in the crotch as possible. My all-time high was getting hit in the balls 12 times against Mason Ryan and Bognor Regis. English wrestlers, who had years of experience wrestling at places like Butlins, had some really fun comedy spots that I'd never seen before. My favorite was called The Head, the Hand, and the Bollocks. The villain would toss the fan favorite out of the ring. When the good guy would try to get back in the ring, the bad guy would stomp his hand, so then he would find a lady in the front row to kiss his hand and make it better. He'd try to get in again, and then the villain would stomp his head, which the same lady would kiss as well. Then the 2 opponents would basically flip roles. The villain would try to get back in the ring, and the crowd favorite would kick the middle rope, which would hit him in the balls. The villain would then go back to the same lady, gesture toward his crotch, and ask for a kiss. Naturally, the lady would refuse every time, leading to plenty of laughter among the crowd. I kept thinking that one day they'd find the wrong lady who would actually do it, and then it would turn into a completely different kind of show. Being in that environment added another dimension to wrestling for me. It changed my perception of what wrestling could be and what people want from it, especially in the context of it being more of a variety show. The English wrestlers also had this awesome system where if you made a mistake or committed a crime, common crimes were cock-blocking, making a huge blunder in a match that was an embarrassment to the job, or avoiding setting up the ring. You'd have your case judged by the senior wrestler of the group. If found guilty, you'd be punished by having to run miles. In the middle of the trip, the van would drop off the guilty party on the side of the road, and he'd have to get to the van in 10 minutes or be forced to run another mile. All that time together developed camaraderie, and of course, with all that time came disagreements too. Yet it was the closest I've ever seen a wrestling locker room come to being like a real family. I ended up staying in England for a little over 6 months. Right before I went back to the United States, I wrestled 17 days in a row, doing 21 shows in that time. Sometimes it would be in front of nearly 1,000 people. Sometimes it would be in front of fewer than 15. But it was awesome. Truth be told, if Bryan Dixon had been able to pay a little bit more, I probably would have never left. The lifestyle really appealed to me. I didn't own a lot because there was no room for it in the suitcase I literally lived out of for half a year. There was no stress, no pressure, just driving up and down the roads with interesting guys and wrestling. We essentially lived like gypsies. It was perfect. I try to meet up with Frankie every time I go to England when we run shows there with WWE. I love being able to see Brian Dixon and his family when they occasionally come to the shows, and I'll run into guys like Mikey Whiplash here and there. I love seeing them all, and whenever I go back, I always get this secret longing in my heart for the days gone by when everything was a little more innocent for me. It was the most fun I'd ever had wrestling. Early bird gets the worm. In 2004, New Japan brought me over for 8 different tours, the longest of which was over 6 weeks. Being there so much allowed me to get more comfortable with the style and get to know the Japanese wrestlers better. In March, I won my first Japanese title, the IWGP Junior Tag Team Championship, along with a masked Christopher Daniels. Chris wrestled as Curry Man, a bizarre dancing character whose mask included a curry bowl on top of his head. The Japanese fans loved him, and I always found it funny that Chris wasn't actually a very big fan of curry. Midway through 2004, I had an unexpected surprise that improved my quality of life. Simon and Hiroko Inoki had always been very nice to me, and one day they asked if I wanted to move into the Inoki Sports Management apartment. It was an offer I couldn't refuse. The apartment, which cost nearly $3,000 a month, was a 2-bedroom on 6th Street in Santa Monica, only a handful of blocks from the beach. It was the most expensive place I had ever lived, and I got to live there for free. Being around wrestling 24/7 at the dojo was good for me for a while, but there were times when I needed a break, and the apartment provided that. I had my own room, so I slept better. I had a full kitchen, so I ate better. I had a place to go away to, so I had time to relax. The apartment was only a couple of miles away from the dojo too, so on nice days I could ride my bike there. And of course, if I had a free day, I could enjoy the beach or walk on the 3rd Street Promenade. In between tours, I continued to wrestle on independent shows, mostly for Ring of Honor. Earlier in the year, I won an ROH tournament called Survival of the Fittest, which came down to me and Austin Aries, who just started with ROH a couple of months earlier. Gabe Sapolsky, the booker, loved the finals and subsequently booked Aries and me in a 2 out of 3 falls match that August at Testing the Limit. I was talking to Gabe on the way to the airport when he told me he'd advertised that each fall had a 1-hour time limit. I thought that was weird, especially since there was no plan for any of the falls to go an hour. It was just going to be like any other 2 out of 3 falls match. But then I started thinking. I envisioned leveraging the significant time limit. We could go to an hour draw in each of the first 2 falls. Then, just when it looked like we were going to a 3rd hour-long draw, somewhere around 55 minutes in, Aries would beat me. I called Gabe back and told him my idea. At first, he thought I was joking and laughed, but the more I talked to him, the more he realized I was serious. Given the business model of ROH, the most important thing was selling DVDs and tapes. If we did what I had planned, it would be the longest pro wrestling match in modern history, and my justification was that a ton of ROH fans, as well as non-ROH fans, would buy it, even if they fast-forwarded through most of it. Gabe started to come around, and he eventually said I could do it if I wanted to. When I landed in Philadelphia, I ran the plan past Aries. Gabe had spoken with him earlier, and at first, Aries thought he was ribbing him. After he realized it wasn't a joke, it didn't take long for Aries to agree to the concept. My only concern was the live fans and keeping them engaged. Nothing kills a match quite like a crowd that's bored, but I came up with what I thought was a brilliant idea. Since we were on last, we would have the ring announcer tell the fans that it could end up being a long match, and that neither performer would be offended if an audience member decided to head home. That's right, my brilliant idea was to encourage people to leave in the middle of my match. I thought it would be easier to wrestle the 3 hours if we didn't have to worry about entertaining people live, and I knew the commentary would make it easier for people to watch at home. Unfortunately, people weren't leaving, but they were getting bored, so we improvised and went to our backup plan, exchanging a few falls in what became a 76-minute bout. It is still the longest match of my career, though I've always been disappointed we didn't go the full 3 hours. Around this same time, the Inoki Dojo started running some shows. Simon and Hiroko worked with a few other people who knew the promotion side of wrestling very well, and they also sought some of us who trained there for our advice on booking the shows. We sat in several long meetings coming up with how we should book the first show. The beginning of 2005 looked a lot like my 2004. I wrestled every weekend on independent shows and had a New Japan tour booked for February. However, 2 weeks before the tour was supposed to start, I still didn't have my visa. Simon and Hiroko, who were the ones that actually dealt with New Japan, didn't know why it hadn't arrived, but got back to me about it the next day. They apologized and said I would be on the March tour, which I didn't mind because my body could use the couple of weeks off. Prior to the March tour, I continued to inquire about my visa, and Simon and Hiroko continued to reassure me it would be there any time. 10 days before it was supposed to start, they told me I wouldn't be on the March tour either. In early May, shortly before the Super Juniors tour, I got a call from Simon, who said that New Japan did indeed want me for that month's tour, but because I was a last-minute addition, they would need to lower my pay by $500 per week. I told him thanks, but no thanks. Even with the pay cut, I would have made more money on the 3-week New Japan tour than I would working the entire summer in England. It was one of the few times I made a decision in wrestling because I was angry and felt disrespected. I never found out exactly why all of that happened, though I later learned it had something to do with politics between the Inoki Dojo and New Japan. I was essentially a pawn in a larger struggle. As a result, I never went back to the Inoki Dojo or to New Japan, which is unfortunate because I loved both. My second tour of England was much the same as my first back in 2003. Lots of fun, stress-free wrestling where I could further hone the entertainment aspect of my performance. Also, on my previous trip there, it was kind of like I disappeared from the planet when I was in England. My cell phone didn't work there, so other than trying to make a monthly call to my family, and that's a very loose definition of try, I was pretty much incommunicado. Sometimes on rare days off, I'd go to the library to check my email, and on one such occasion, I had a message in my inbox, from CM Punk I believe, though I could be mistaken, citing a rumor that both WWE and TNA, Total Nonstop Action, were interested in Ring of Honor's 3 top guys, Punk, Samoa Joe, and me. I'd done a few enhancement matches for WWE earlier in the year, and knew I was at least on their radar, because I was always given competitive matches rather than just getting squashed. After that email, I became more conscious of getting to the library on days off. Soon after, Samoa Joe signed with TNA, and they pushed him right away on TV. Punk went the other way and signed a developmental deal with WWE. I stayed in England for 4 months on this trip without hearing anything more about it. When I flew back to the United States that September, I kind of expected to be offered a deal by one of the 2 organizations. But when I turned my phone on, I didn't have a single voicemail, and nobody from either company contacted me in the weeks that followed. To be fair, I didn't call them either. That's that lack of ambition. I did, however, receive a phone call from Gabe Sapolsky, booker of Ring of Honor. He didn't reach out to offer me a contract or a ton of money. His offer was something different. My first opportunity to be the man, as Ric Flair often described it. Gabe has admitted he never saw that potential in me at first. He thought I was a great wrestler but lacked the ability to be the guy the company was based around. He saw that trait in Punk, and he saw it in Samoa Joe, who had a nearly 2-year reign with the ROH title. Those guys were locker room leaders, and each of them had a unique charisma. Gabe saw me as a nice, quiet guy, content to just do my own thing. With Punk leaving for WWE and Joe heading to TNA, Jamie Noble, known as James Gibson in Ring of Honor, won the ROH Championship in August 2005. But not too long after that, WWE offered Jamie a contract to return, which he took, and Gabe was out of options. "You're the guy we want to build around," Gabe said to me, "but to do that, I have to know that you won't leave for WWE or TNA or be gone all the time on Japan tours." I didn't have any offers from those larger organizations, and I hadn't heard a word from New Japan since I left for England, but there was definitely more to consider than that before accepting. Being ROH champion was a tough gig. They would rely on my matches to sell DVDs and bring people to the buildings. To go on last and send the people home happy was a considerable challenge, because everyone was trying to have the best match on the card, and by the time you went out there, the fans had seen it all. Nonetheless, it wasn't more than a few seconds before I agreed. I vowed I wouldn't go to WWE, and that I'd put all of my energy into ROH for at least 1 year. It was a huge opportunity, but I needed to raise my game. At Glory by Honor 4, on September 17, 2005, I beat Jamie Noble, competing under his real name, James Gibson, for the Ring of Honor World Championship. Even though we didn't go on last, I knew we were the main event. Jamie and I wrestled our hearts out for over 20 minutes in front of the very appreciative fans in Lake Grove, New York. I always loved wrestling Jamie, but this was the first time we got to have that kind of match. The kind of match people would remember. When it ended, after Jamie ultimately tapped out to the crossface chicken wing, the crowd erupted. He and I hugged, after which I grabbed the microphone and promised the fans that while I was champion, I wouldn't even think of leaving Ring of Honor. Ironically enough, I missed the next 2 ROH shows, 2 of the biggest shows in the company's history because they featured a rare appearance in America by Japanese wrestling legend Kenta Kobashi, because they took place on the weekend my sister got married. To me, some things are more important than wrestling. My Ring of Honor World Championship win has always ranked very high on my list of accomplishments. They chose me to be the man, and that hasn't happened very often in my career. It was one of the few times when it was decided I was going to be given the ball and get pushed into the top spot to carry the promotion. Before I won the title, the ROH fans hadn't seen me since May, when I had a shaved head and a long beard. When I returned, I came back clean-cut with no beard and neatly trimmed hair. Whereas before I wore black, I came back wearing all maroon, gear given to me by William Regal. I even came out wearing a maroon jacket with the American Dragon embroidered on the back. It was a more classic look, inspired by an older generation of wrestlers like Bob Backlund and Billy Robinson, symbolizing that I would be more of a sportsman and less of an entertainer. Soon, I realized that was a mistake. My very first championship defense was against AJ Styles, and our rivalry was based on a story about who of us was the better wrestler. We both wrestled on the aggressive side, but at the end of the match, fans were supposed to like both of us. We had a good match with a decent response from the crowd, but it wasn't what a title match should be as far as crowd reaction. The same happened with the next several title matches, none of which lit the world on fire. I knew I needed to change something or my title reign was going to bomb. It wasn't until I was in the ring wrestling Roderick Strong that I found the answer. The fans in Connecticut were fully behind Roderick, with a few of them jeering me. I started to subtly get more aggressive, then became less subtle about it. That kind of transformation isn't so strange in wrestling, but my thought process changed. I am the Ring of Honor World Champion, and this guy isn't in my league. In fact, not only is Roderick not in my league, nobody is in my league. Not anybody in ROH, not anybody in WWE. I am the best, and I will prove it every night. That night, after I beat Roderick, I cut a promo about being the best in the world, and it stuck throughout my 462-day reign. It doesn't sound that great now, since people have heard both Chris Jericho and CM Punk claim to be the best in the world on national TV. But at the time, nobody had consistently made that claim in years. It legitimized me among the independent wrestling fan base, and I was then a top guy anywhere I went, against anybody I faced. It worked because it was boastful and gave me an attitude. It was also a rallying cry for the Ring of Honor fans. They believed ROH was producing the best wrestling in America. WWE was far too interested in entertainment, and that didn't appeal to this audience, who wanted something grittier and organic. They wanted most of their action between the ropes, not on the microphone or in silly backstage vignettes. Most of all, they wanted to believe that the wrestlers they watched at Ring of Honor events, at least some of them, were better than those appearing on TV programming of larger organizations. So I changed my character to appeal to that desire. The night of that first match against Roderick was also the first in a series of experiments I was doing on wrestling finishes. A standard wrestling trope was that you beat guys with your finisher. Some guys have two, but very rarely do people have more than a couple of moves that they will actually beat guys with. For the more astute fans, matches become more predictable. They know that even if a wrestler hits another with a big impact move, if it's not his finisher, it won't end the match. I wanted people to think that a match could end at any time. On top of that, though the hardcore fans at ROH very much appreciated wrestling, it was hard to get them to believe that any of it was legitimate, after so many years of WWE saying it was all just entertainment. We didn't need people to believe the whole thing was real, though, just part of it. Guys lose their tempers and sometimes things get real in the ring. Most people never know it because it just seems like sloppy wrestling. My idea was to create a moment in which the audience would wonder if what they were seeing was actually real. The finish of the Roderick match was something that legitimately happened to us. One night after a show, a bunch of us were hanging out in my hotel room, and Roderick was drunk, his behavior growing more and more irritating as he jumped all over the place while I was lying in bed. I told him to get out of the room if he was going to be annoying, so he charged and sprang on top of me. I immediately put Roddy in an omoplata shoulder lock with my legs until he screamed. It didn't take long, and then I let go. Gabe was in the room and saw the whole thing. He thought it was awesome, and later that week, he told me he wanted that to be the finish in our upcoming match. I agreed, although only if Roderick wasn't drunk. So we did it. In the match, Roderick was chopping me so hard that my chest was bleeding. As lots of wrestling fans who've tried chopping each other know, it hurts. Chops make a loud, visceral sound, and people know they sting. So it wasn't hard for fans to believe that with all the chops Roddy had given me, I was pissed off. Instead of the usual cavalcade of moves before the finish of a big match, we just started elbowing each other in the face really hard until Roddy nearly knocked me out. He went to jump on me, and just like in the hotel room, I instantly put him in the omoplata. Rather than the typical milking of the submission, Roderick tapped almost immediately, rolling to the floor without selling anything. He was pissed off, I got up pissed off, and then I spit on him and said he was a piece of shit. People in the arena had no idea what had just happened. It looked as if, in the middle of a normal wrestling match, tempers flared and a fight broke out. That was exactly what I wanted. Weeks later, our rematch had a different buzz about it, and Roderick had gained even more support from the fans. The entire match was aggressive and hard-hitting. Even though the scars hadn't healed from the first match, he chopped me until my chest was bleeding again. Finally, I beat Roderick by putting him in a crucifix and elbowing him until he was knocked out, an idea I got from a Gary Goodridge fight in UFC. The referee had to stop me from elbowing Roderick after he was knocked out, and in one night, we created a new way a match could end in ROH, a referee stoppage. The fans didn't understand it at first, and some were pissed off, but you have to take chances sometimes, and this one made my matches ahead much more interesting. When I competed in Ring of Honor, my character was much different than how I've come to be known in WWE. Within WWE, I've constantly been portrayed as an underdog. In ROH, I wasn't a small guy compared to the other guys, especially those last couple of years when I was the top guy. Whomever I was facing was actually the underdog. One of the more popular things people would chant over and over again toward my opponent was, "You're going to get your fucking head kicked in." It originated in England for soccer and got popular for wrestling in Ring of Honor. My style was more technical wrestling, but brutal, incorporating a lot of MMA movements into what I did, like the repeated elbows or repeated stomps to the skull. Ring of Honor crowds saw me as a badass with a big beard and a shaved head. Ring of Honor opened up 2006 with a hot interpromotional feud with a company called Combat Zone Wrestling, CZW. Each organization had its own passionate fan base, which really contributed to the success of this rivalry. CZW was known for doing extremely violent wrestling that incorporated a great many weapons in matches. By this point, using things like tables and chairs was commonplace in mainstream wrestling. CZW took things a step further. Instead of just putting somebody through a table, they would put somebody through a barbed wire table that was on fire. They would hit people not only with chairs, but with things like long fluorescent light tubes that shattered on impact. I even saw a guy turn on a weed whacker and use it on his opponent. Their fans loved it. Most of our fans, however, thought it was garbage wrestling, and that the CZW wrestlers were vastly inferior to the regulars of Ring of Honor. On the flip side, a lot of CZW fans found technical wrestlers like me boring, and they didn't like what they perceived to be Ring of Honor's elitist attitude. With both companies based in Philadelphia, it was a perfect rivalry. It started off with some CZW wrestlers invading an ROH show, and Chris Hero, one of their promotion's top performers, challenging me for the ROH title. In return, we invaded a CZW event when we were running a show across town the same night. The first time I'd ever been in the famed ECW arena in downtown Philadelphia. A bunch of wild brawls broke out, including one in which ROH wrestler BJ Whitmer had a sheet of paper stapled to his forehead. The fans of each company were white hot for the feud, leading to my match with Hero for the ROH Championship in Philadelphia on January 14th. You need to know when to wrestle and when to fight. That night in January 2006 was a time when I chose the wrong option. I'd say that match was my biggest failure as Ring of Honor champion. In 2006, ROH made a great business decision by running shows in WrestleMania's hosting city the 2 nights prior to WWE's mega event. WrestleMania brings in dedicated hardcore wrestling fans from all over the world every year. So while they were all in town, even people who'd only heard about Ring of Honor on the internet could come watch a show. It led to big business for ROH, and they've done it every year since. That year, WrestleMania 22 was in Chicago, one of the cities with the most ROH fans. Our first show, on Friday, had more than 1,000 people, and they seemed to really love it, with the exception of how long the show was. Gabe wanted me and Roderick Strong to tease an hour-long draw, but have me beat him right before the 60-minute time limit. It was a great idea, but the problem was the show started at 8 p.m., and by the time Roderick and I went to the ring, it was already after midnight. The full show had already been going on for 4 hours. The crowd was tired, and I could see people leaving midway through our match. I couldn't help but think, I wish they would have done that for the Aries match. Yet we got through it, and the crowd gave us a polite applause after we wrestled for 55 minutes, ending the show at 1 a.m. The following night was way better, and we had a record-setting attendance for an ROH show with over 1,600 people. I wrestled former WWE, WCW, and ECW star Lance Storm, who was coming out of retirement, for the ROH title in a fun match. Nobody in the crowd left during it, so I considered that a huge success. When I'd returned from England a year before, I'd moved back in with my mom and enrolled in Grace Harbor Community College in Aberdeen for the fall quarter. Now, in the middle of the winter quarter, Ring of Honor presented me with another opportunity. I had a chance to go from student to instructor again when they offered me the role of trainer at the Ring of Honor school they'd opened in Philadelphia. When it initially opened, the wrestling school's first trainer was CM Punk, but he got signed by WWE. Austin Aries was the next trainer, but then he got signed by TNA. I'd be the third trainer since the school's inception, and despite knowing I wasn't the best trainer while in APW, I assumed that I would be better some 4 years later after amassing so much more experience. My apartment would be paid for, and I'd also make a commission on any students who attended. Besides that, my sister had moved to a place in Pennsylvania about 90 minutes from where I'd be living. So I finished the winter quarter at Grace Harbor, and in April 2006, I drove the nearly 3,000 miles from Aberdeen to Philly. In summer 2006, I had my first encounters with one of my all-time best opponents, an English wrestler named Nigel McGuinness. Outside the ring, I enjoyed being around Nigel because he was super intelligent and had a great self-deprecating sense of humor. He and I became exceptionally good friends, and the tremendous chemistry we developed carried over into the ring, where I had some of the greatest matches of my career against him. The most memorable bout was at a show called Unified, which was Ring of Honor's first event in England. At one point during the match, I grabbed Nigel by both arms and pulled him into the ring post head first, causing him to bleed. It was Nigel's idea, but he wasn't sure if he could get the post to bust him open. I suggested blading, but he wanted to do it the hard way. We decided I would pull him in 3 times, and if he didn't bleed, we'd stop. After 3 attempts, he wasn't bleeding, but he yelled at me, "One more time." This time, he slammed his head really hard into the post, and the blood started pouring like crazy. We continued on, the blood adding more and more drama, until finally I did the same thing to him that I did to Roderick. I put him in a crucifix and elbowed him until he was knocked out. The match was great and sold a ton of DVDs, but looking back, the ends didn't justify the means. Due to the shot to the ring post, Nigel had an enormous hematoma on his forehead, a huge knot of blood that slowly drained down to his eye. He ended up with serious concussion problems because of things like that, although that ring post spot may have been the most visual example. We've all done a lot of stupid things in wrestling. Some end up being worth it, others not. Even though it was a great match, it wasn't worth what Nigel ended up paying for it. In August of 2006, I had 3 one-hour matches within a 2-week period, 2 of them on back-to-back nights. It used to be that the NWA World Heavyweight Champion toured all over the world and worked with a top star in every territory. Sometimes he would win clean, but oftentimes because the champion would be moving on and the local star would continue wrestling in the area, they would wrestle to a 60-minute draw. Lou Thez did it, Harley Race did it, Ric Flair did it. I looked at it as my chance to do it. Unfortunately, wrestling fans don't have the patience they used to, and, just as unfortunately, I am not as good as my predecessors at going 60 minutes. None of the hour-long matches were bad, they just weren't epic in the way you want it to be. The first one was against Samoa Joe in New Jersey, and I cannot remember a single thing about it. The second hour-long match was against Nigel in St. Paul, Minnesota. It was probably the worst of all the matches Nigel and I had against each other, and he got another concussion to boot. Everything about it was regrettable. The following night, I wrestled Colt Cabana in his hometown of Chicago, the third and most memorable of the 60-minute matches, but not necessarily because it was good. Roughly 5 minutes into the match, I was pushing Cabana into the ring ropes, and as he came off them, I'd catch him with a headbutt to the stomach. We did it a few times until he stepped aside on the last attempted headbutt, sending me crashing to the floor. I had previously fallen that exact same way well over 100 times, and never once do I remember even stubbing my toe. This time, however, I missed posting on the apron with my hand as I fell, and I crashed down shoulder first. I knew something was wrong, so I took my sweet-ass time getting back into the ring, hoping I could shake it off. It didn't help. I was lucky I was in there with Cabana, because he can be entertaining without throwing you all around. Still, everything I did hurt. At one point, I was going to give him a diving headbutt off the top rope, trying to gut through it, though I knew I was just going to make it worse. I could have stepped down, but I knew I would look stupid, so instead, I jumped off the turnbuckle and stomped Cabana right in the chest, way harder than I intended. He let out this guttural sound on impact and had a hard time breathing for the next minute, but we were able to get through the match. After I flew back to Philadelphia the next morning, I went to the hospital. The doctor told me I had partially torn 2 tendons and, more distressingly, separated my right shoulder, the same one I separated in 2000 and the same side I'd have problems with later on in my career. I had bookings over the next 2 weeks, which for the first time in my career, I had to cancel due to injury. In 3 weeks, I was scheduled to wrestle Japanese star Kenta, now Hideo Itami in WWE, for the ROH Championship in New York City. Everyone knew I was hurt because Ring of Honor had covered my injury on their website. Given my reported condition and how Kenta was positioned around that time, most people expected him to beat me. In American wrestling, if somebody has a legit injury, you try to mostly stay away from it to avoid further injury. For example, with my shoulder hurt, someone might attack my leg. In Japan, if the fans know you have a real injury, the wrestlers almost feel obligated to treat it like a legitimate fight and attack an injured body part to avoid insulting the intelligence of the fans. Kenta and I took the Japanese route. Instead of protecting it, Kenta kicked the shit out of my right arm the entire match. My girlfriend at the time was in the crowd, and she was literally crying in the middle of the match, with one of the other wrestlers trying to settle her by telling her I was okay. But I was more than okay. I felt alive. With the emotion of the crowd, the physical intensity of the match, and the story that was told throughout it, it is undoubtedly one of my favorite matches of my career. When I put Kenta in cattle mutilation and he tapped out, the crowd erupted. It was one of those times when the pain was worth it. After the Kenta match, I did my first tour of Japan for Pro Wrestling Noah, basically so that Kenta could get his win back in front of the Japanese audience. I did my best, but with my shoulder getting progressively worse, I focused on trying to make it until Ring of Honor's biggest show of the year, Final Battle. At that event on December 23, 2006, a wildly popular wrestler named Homicide beat me for the Ring of Honor World Championship in front of a sellout Manhattan Center crowd, our second show in the building. My shoulder was a wreck, but Homicide and I tried to pull out all the stops to make his title win as memorable for the fans as it could be. In the end, Homicide hit me with his cop killer, one of the coolest looking moves in wrestling, then pinned me as the crowd went nuts. My 462-day title reign was over. When I was healthy enough to return to the ring, I was thrown right into the fire. Despite not being my best during my first Japan tour with Pro Wrestling Noah, the promotion brought me back for a 4-week tour in April of 2007. With my shoulder healthy and my body feeling rejuvenated, I made a much better showing after shaking off the early ring rust. On that tour was the first time I met Ted DiBiase Jr., the son of the $1 Million Man, a WWE Hall of Famer. Teddy had only competed in 16 matches before he went on the tour, which reminded me of my first tour with FMW. The big difference was that Teddy was way better this early in his career than I was the first time I went to Japan. As far as having a natural instinct for wrestling, Teddy might be the best I've ever seen. There were definitely times when he showed his inexperience, but 90% of it he did really well, and I was impressed. Not only that, but he was also fun to be around. With his Mississippi accent and his southern hospitality, it was hard not to immediately like the guy. Soon after this tour, Teddy signed to a WWE developmental deal, and I couldn't have been happier for him. By May 2007, it had been over 5 months since I had wrestled for Ring of Honor, and I was excited to come back, especially because they had made some major changes since I'd left. In early May, ROH announced they had signed a deal to produce bi-monthly pay-per-view events. The inaugural pay-per-view taping, called Respect is Earned, featured my return to ROH, and it was back at the Manhattan Center on May 12th. Everyone in the locker room was amped for the opportunity to be on pay-per-view, including me. The fans were really excited too. I wrestled in the main event, teaming with a 350-pound Noah wrestler named Takeshi Morishima, who'd beaten Homicide for the ROH World title, to face Nigel and Kenta. After Morishima and I won, he dumped me on my head for being a dick, and then Nigel clotheslined Morishima in the face, thus creating 2 potential challengers for the ROH title. I thought the show was an excellent introduction to the promotion for people who had never before seen our wrestling. It established who all the characters were, who the rivals were, and why the fans should care. The following month, Nigel and I wrestled each other in the main event of the second ROH pay-per-view, Driven 2007. Toward the end of the match, Nigel and I started headbutting each other without putting our hands up for protection, as if we were 2 rams butting heads to display our dominance. In the middle of the exchange, I was cut wide open at the top of my hairline, and blood poured down my face. The fans loved it. On Monday, June 25th, 2007, I was in the car driving home to Aberdeen from Olympia, Washington, after 2 hours of kickboxing and jiu-jitsu. I was exhausted and content with about 15 minutes left in my hour-long ride when I got a call from my friends Mike and Christoph. They were watching Monday Night Raw, and WWE had just announced that Chris Benoit, his wife Nancy, and their 7-year-old son Daniel had been found dead in their Atlanta home. I went straight to Mike and Christoph's apartment, and we watched Raw together in shock. Chris Benoit had been one of my favorites, and someone I'd patterned my career after. He had wrestled all over the world, getting better everywhere he went. And by the time he made it to WWE, he was one of the best wrestlers on the planet. Beyond my professional admiration, the few times I met him, he was very kind to me. I was crushed. The next day, horrific details started coming out, and what was eventually discovered was that Chris had killed both his wife and son, then hanged himself. The Benoit double murder-suicide horrified people, and media outlets picked up on it right away. People tried to figure out why it happened, with speculation that it was caused by roid rage, or because Chris and Nancy's marriage was falling apart. To this day, there is no definitive reason for why it happened, and there probably never will be. But investigations led to the Sports Legacy Institute performing a series of tests on Benoit's brain, which according to Dr. Julian Bales, was so severely damaged it resembled the brain of an 85-year-old Alzheimer's patient. The type of brain damage Benoit had is known as chronic traumatic encephalopathy, CTE, which researchers believe is connected to having multiple head injuries. CTE's most common symptoms include depression, cognitive impairment, dementia, Parkinsonism, and erratic behavior, and many experts believe CTE was a significant contributing factor in the Benoit tragedy. Multiple NFL players who committed suicide were found to have CTE as well, and the condition became a major news story in itself. There was a palpable shift in the nationwide awareness of the dangers of head injuries and concussions. Chris Benoit popularized a wrestling style that was hard-nosed and aggressive, with lots of explosive suplexes and diving headbutts off the top rope. Looking back on it, you can see how easy it would have been for him to have multiple undiagnosed concussions. It was the same style that influenced me and many wrestlers of the new generation. It was action-packed and exciting, with an element of physical violence that was believable. That kind of wrestling is what made me and many of the other guys in ROH stand out from the pack. When Nigel and I did the headbutts in June at the Driven pay-per-view, it seemed awesome. 2 warriors ramming each other in the head until one of them bled. It made for a great visual, and spots like that showed our love for the business and our willingness to do anything for the fans. But when the match finally aired on pay-per-view on September 21st, with all the awareness around the dangers of head injuries, it no longer seemed awesome. It seemed stupid, and it seemed reckless, which made people question why they supported something that endangered the long-term health of the performers. In hindsight, Gabe told me, he wished they'd never aired it. After the Benoit tragedy, the perception of wrestling became so negative that many fans no longer cared to watch, especially a company like Ring of Honor, which heavily featured a style similar to the one Benoit helped to popularize. Initially, ROH pay-per-views garnered around 10,000 buys, which was phenomenal for a company whose only exposure was through word of mouth and the internet. However, with each passing pay-per-view, buys dropped, and after the 6-event deal was up, ROH chose not to renew it. The paradigm of how we should be wrestling was shifting. Some people accept new paradigms quickly. In this instance, I was not one of them. Despite all the concussion awareness and my own acknowledgement of certain dangers, I refused to tone it down. I stopped the aggressive headbutting, but I kept everything else about my in-ring performance the same. In mid-2007, I ruptured my left eardrum during a wild open-palmed exchange with Kenta, in which one errant shot caught me in my left ear. I never got it fixed, and even now I don't hear as well on my left side. Later in the year, I detached my retina, in another example of my own stupidity. I had another surprise in early 2008, the first time I wrestled Tyler Black, who is also now in WWE as Seth Rollins. Rollins had come into ROH a couple of months prior to our collision, mostly participating in tag matches and even winning the ROH tag titles. I had seen his matches and I respected his athletic ability and poise in the ring. His trunks were too small, but I could look past that. I really looked forward to our match. Truthfully, we needed some new guys fans would accept as main event talent in ROH, and Gabe thought Rollins had it. Gabe knew what he was talking about. In the ring that night, Rollins made an impression on me and the entire ROH crowd. Even though we weren't in the main event, they titled the DVD Breakout because of Rollins' performance in our match, and I was happy to be a part of it. After that, he and I ended up having a series of matches, my favorite of which took place in Detroit. He gave me a powerbomb into the turnbuckle and the whole thing broke, adding chaos and unpredictability to the match. Instead of getting flustered, he improvised, and that match was one of the best I had that year. Yes for the masses. On June 7th, 2008, I got the first of the 2 phone calls I ever had from Vince McMahon. I was in my hotel room in Hartford, Connecticut, where we'd just done a show for ROH. At first, when he introduced himself, I laughed because I thought someone was ribbing me. Vince McMahon has a very distinct voice, one that many people are good at imitating. What initially made me suspect it might actually be him was that he said he had been speaking with Shawn Michaels. 2 weeks earlier, Shawn had called me, and it was the first time we had talked in several years. He asked how I was, but quickly got to the point. He was in the middle of a feud with Chris Jericho, and they were getting Lance Cade involved in the story because Shawn had trained him. They thought getting me involved too would be an interesting twist. I could potentially come in beside Shawn and then turn on my one-time teacher to form an alliance with Chris and Lance. Shawn didn't try to pressure me at all, but he explained it would be a great spot for me to come into if I wanted to go to WWE, something I hadn't even thought of since 2005. He said that he knew, from speaking with William Regal, that I liked the independence and that I preferred being more of a starving artist. This was the first time I'd heard that in reference to me, and it kind of made me proud, since I never aspired to be wealthy, and it was mostly the artistic form of wrestling that I truly enjoyed. We had a good conversation, and I expressed that I'd be interested if we could work things out with ROH, with whom I was still under contract. It was most certainly the real Vince McMahon on the phone. He said Shawn had spoken highly of me, and then he told me he'd like to have a meeting with me in Oakland, California that Monday before Raw. I mentioned that I could meet him that day if he wanted, noting that I was in Hartford, Connecticut, which I confused with Stamford, where WWE headquarters is located. I couldn't understand why he wouldn't just meet me the same day. It was kind of embarrassing, though Vince never pointed out my stupidity, which I only realized when we passed Stamford on the way from Hartford to our show in Newark, New Jersey. That all aside, I agreed to the meeting in California. I met with Vince on Monday and was very uncomfortable. Wearing the suit didn't help, as I was awkward in it, which is especially noticeable in the presence of people who wear them so easily. That wasn't the only thing. Almost as soon as he saw me, Vince seemed taken aback that I was the one Shawn had talked so much about. I'm not sure if it was because of my size or just because of how plain I look in general, and my personality didn't seem to help things. Our conversation went a little something like this. "Shawn says you're very good," Vince said. "Yeah, I'm okay," I replied. "Just okay?" he asked. "Well, yeah," I very casually stated. "I've got a match tonight if you'd like to see." Knowing Vince a little better now, I could see how he would have hated that. He wants people who will say, "No, I'm the best," and not just say it, believe it. But except during promos, I wouldn't say that then, and I wouldn't say that now. Some people think I'm good, some people don't. I let people decide on their own, which is not a top guy attitude, at least not to Vince. We talked a bit longer, and I explained that I was under contract with Ring of Honor, but had their full blessing in coming to see him. He asked me if I wanted to come wrestle for WWE, probably because Shawn mentioned the starving artist thing, and I told him I had concerns. I said that WWE didn't have the best history of pushing smaller guys like me, and I wasn't as acrobatic as somebody like Rey Mysterio. I think that comment made Vince raise an eyebrow as well. But overall, despite my nervousness, and my slight anxiety about whether or not I was supposed to keep the suit jacket buttoned when I sat down, I thought it went well. My match that night went well too. I wrestled Lance Cade, and not only did we have a good little match, but there were quite a few fans who knew who I was and gave me a good reception. It helped that Lance and I had known each other for years, and he did his best to make me look good. Afterward, John Laurinaitis, who was in charge of WWE Talent Relations, told me they were definitely interested and that he'd call me that week. 2 days later, I went to Mexico for a week to perform in one of its biggest wrestling shows, Triple Mania. When I came back from Mexico, I had an ROH show and then left for 3 months to England. I didn't hear from Laurinaitis until he called, literally, as I checked in my bags for the flight to the UK. I told him my phone wouldn't work while I was in England, but I gave him my email address so he could contact me if WWE was interested in using me. I checked my email religiously that trip, but I never received a message from him. On the flip side, it would have been very easy for me to have called Johnny regularly while in England, just to check in and see what the status was. But of course, that sort of ambition was not my style. It was at an ROH show called the Tokyo Summit on September 14th, 2008, where I won the Global Honored Crown GHC Junior Heavyweight Championship from Yoshinobu Kanemaru, who was the title's very first champion and had held it multiple times. During my many tours of Japan, it was the only singles title I had won. When I returned home from the Japan tour, I was shocked to find out that Gabe Sapolsky had been fired from Ring of Honor, and I was devastated. Gabe had been the booker since ROH's inception, and we had a great working relationship. He always listened to my ideas and was honest with me when things were good and when things weren't so good. Unfortunately, the business side of ROH had grown stagnant, and the organization was losing a significant amount of money. Wrestling's popularity had declined, and the amount of people looking for alternatives to the wrestling they saw on television was limited. So Kerry Silken, the sole owner of ROH and the individual whose finances kept it afloat, decided to make a change. Kerry loved wrestling and grew up as a big WWE fan when Bruno Sammartino was the champion. He collected old wrestling posters and magazines and loved showing them to the guys who appreciated them. He would often give me old wrestling magazines, my favorite of which had Nature Boy Buddy Rogers on the cover in an iconic wrestling pose. When Kerry decided to replace Gabe, he went with someone he thought would incorporate some of the more old-school ideology he loved. Enter Adam Pearce, an independent wrestler known for his traditional style. He was one of the best bad guys on the independent scene and had wrestled all over the country, making people hate him. Whereas Gabe would book longer shows in which the participants in almost every match tried to steal the show, Pearce wanted shorter shows with the guys on the undercard working hard but not busting out every trick in the book. Kerry was also trying to make budget cuts, and he thought Pearce would be more willing to use fewer performers on each show. Though I honestly didn't think a change in bookers would make the company profitable, I understood why Kerry made the change. Prior to his termination, Gabe was booking me with Claudio Castagnoli, Cesaro, in a feud that was supposed to culminate in December at Final Battle, the biggest ROH show of the year. The match was set up at the Manhattan Center in an incredible moment where Claudio crushed my head beneath a steel chair. When Pearce came on board, he had a different plan. He ended my feud with Claudio right away, which disappointed both of us. Instead, Pearce booked me against Morishima, who hadn't been in ROH all year, in a match called A Fight Without Honor, a rare match in Ring of Honor where absolutely anything goes. Given our past together, it was a smart move, and the fans in New York City were excited to see it. My proudest moment as an independent wrestler was ROH's Final Battle 2008. In WWE, there's a stigma about independent wrestlers that before we got to WWE, we all just wrestled in front of 100 people at an armory somewhere. Yes, most of us did that. But we also did things like this show. On December 27th, 2008, Ring of Honor drew their record crowd of over 2,500 fans to the Hammerstein Ballroom in New York City. We did that without having a television show and without having any big-name wrestling stars from the past. It was us. All of us. We created something that fans wanted to see, and though Ring of Honor may be a niche product, we were able to garner a huge amount of fan support based on the quality of our wrestling and the fans' belief that what they were seeing was important. Ring of Honor moved the show from the Manhattan Center to the Hammerstein Ballroom, a larger room in the same building. In the main event, I wrestled Morishima in our bloodiest and most violent match yet. It was a true grudge match, culminating with me giving Morishima the crucifix elbows to the face, with a chain wrapped around my arm, then putting him in cattle mutilation. The crowd erupted when I won, and it was a great finish to a great show. With all my health issues starting to add up, I decided to give WWE one last attempt and gave myself all of 2009 to get signed. If it didn't work, I was going to cut back on my independent dates and resume going to school, changing the focus of where I put my energy. By 2009, I'd really started to enjoy kickboxing and submission grappling, but unfortunately, there weren't any places to train in Aberdeen. I would drive an hour to Olympia, train kickboxing in one gym, then drive over to another gym to train jiu-jitsu. I tried to do it a few times each week, but when I was exhausted from traveling, the last thing I wanted to do was spend 2 hours in a car just to go train. If I was going to change my focus at the end of the year, I was going to spend the next year doing what I wanted. With this in mind, that January, I moved to Las Vegas. In the summer, the lease on my apartment was about to expire, and I was still unsure of what might be next with WWE. Toward the end of the summer, I'd pretty much thrown in the towel and accepted that WWE wasn't interested in signing me, when Johnny finally called me in late August. Having just come back from grappling training with Neil, I was a sweaty mess when I answered the phone. He offered me a contract, not a developmental contract, which most new signees get, but a regular talent contract. Earlier in the year, when I resolved to get to WWE, I told myself that if they offered me a developmental deal, I'd turn it down. So I was relieved they weren't going to try to send me to Florida Championship Wrestling, FCW, their developmental system, where people sometimes got stuck for years. Luckily, my contract ensured that I'd pretty much go straight to the main roster, or so I thought. I thanked Laurinaitis as I got off the phone, super excited. I found out shortly thereafter that WWE had offered Nigel McGuinness a contract as well, which was great. We had helped to build each other on the independents, and now we'd get that same opportunity in WWE. All we had to do, in order for it to be official, was go through WWE's standard medical screening in Pittsburgh. When I landed, Nigel picked me up, and with us was another WWE signee who was also there for a health screening. We didn't know her, but she was a Playboy Playmate of the Year who knew next to nothing about wrestling. I'm not quite sure she had even seen any wrestling before either, but it didn't matter. She was nice, and all three of us were pretty happy on our way to meet the doctors. I've always prided myself on being a fairly honest person. Bree says I'm too honest sometimes. On this occasion, though, when the doctors asked me if I'd ever had any surgeries or major injuries, I just said no. I made no mention of the detached retina, no mention of the shoulder issues, and no mention of the concussions. I told them I was perfectly fine. For some reason, I've always found it easier to lie to doctors than normal people. Nigel took a different approach. He was completely honest with the doctor, minus maybe the concussions, mostly because he thought he had no need to worry. Earlier in the year, he'd torn his bicep, and instead of getting surgery, he took time off to rehab it, just like I did with my shoulder several years earlier. He came back to wrestling when his doctor told him he was ready to go, and the bicep was all healed. Nigel disclosed all of this to the doctor at the medical screening, assuming it would be fine, but it wasn't. Before they would sign him, they wanted to do more testing on his bicep. I wasn't exactly fine either. I'll explain shortly. The first person I called after WWE reached out to offer me a contract was Kerry Silken, the owner of Ring of Honor. I let him know what was going on and thanked him for all the opportunities ROH had given me. Shortly thereafter, ROH booked what they called the Final Countdown Tour, a series of 6 shows that were supposed to be the fans' last opportunity to see me and Nigel compete in Ring of Honor. This would be the perfect ending to my time with ROH, and I had just one other project I wanted to see to its end before heading to WWE. Previously, fellow indie star Colt Cabana and I had discussed doing a documentary on our lives as independent wrestlers, inspired by Robbie Brookside, who filmed a similar documentary that aired on British television in the 1990s. We had big plans initially. We wanted to rent an RV and drive all over the country doing shows. But with my Japan tours and long distances between shows, like one weekend in Philadelphia and the next in Los Angeles, we settled on documenting a 10-week tour. When I got contacted by WWE, Cabana had everything set up for the filming, and though he was actually worried I would cancel the shoot, I thought the addition of me signing with Vince McMahon's organization would make the documentary even more interesting. We were moving forward with what we called the Wrestling Road Diaries. Cabana started the trip in Chicago with an Englishman named John, who hopped on for the ride and filmed the whole thing. Together, they drove 750 miles to Philadelphia, the site of the first 2 Final Countdown Tour shows, to meet up with me and Sal Renaro, an independent wrestler from Georgia, whom Cabana and I loved because he's hilarious, kind-hearted, and always in good spirits. Over our 10-day trip, we wrestled on 7 shows, from the famed ECW Arena to a garage in Connecticut and even an amusement park in Ohio, where I wrestled almost 5 straight minutes with my butt exposed, on purpose. Then ended with a big Ring of Honor show in Chicago. Along the way, we did seminars at 2 wrestling schools, visited my sister while she was pregnant with my first niece, and in general, just had a great time. The only thing that put a mild damper on the whole thing was a call I got from the doctor in Pittsburgh. According to the test I'd taken, I had really high cholesterol, and far more concerning, severely elevated liver enzymes. The doctor asked me if I drank a lot, and I told him I'd never had a drink in my life. He also asked about steroids, and I never used them either. Since blood test results already ruled out hepatitis, a disease of the liver, those two are the most common reasons to have elevated liver enzymes. The third most common reason was cancer. I was scared to death. Plus, WWE couldn't officially sign me until I'd been medically cleared. With that cloud hanging over my head, I nonetheless finished the rest of the trip. At the last show in Chicago, I wrestled Austin Aries in a match I truly enjoyed. Then, after the show was over, I said goodbye to Cabana, Sal, and John. It had been a really fun trip. When I got back to Vegas, Nigel and I were both still waiting for our WWE contracts to go into effect, and they had me doing all sorts of tests. MRIs, more blood tests, and even a colonoscopy, which was miserable. I went into my final ROH show not knowing if I would actually be leaving. Before the show at the Manhattan Center, ROH promoted an autograph signing for both me and Nigel as the last time fans would get to see us. As we signed, we joked with each other that there was a good chance we might be back a lot sooner than people thought. We laughed about it, but we were both legitimately nervous. My last match for ROH was on September 26th, 2009, and fittingly, I wrestled Nigel in the main event. It was a difficult task. We wanted to do justice to the matches we'd had before, but we also wanted to stay safe, which is easier said than done in wrestling. When Nigel caught me on the springboard dive into the crowd, the back of his head hit a chair. All of a sudden, he was loopy and probably concussed. We continued on and tried to give the audience one final classic match. I'm not sure we quite reached that, but the fans reacted like we had all the same. When the match was over, all the ROH wrestlers and employees surrounded the ring, as Nigel and I said farewell to Ring of Honor. The crowd gave us a standing ovation, a demonstration of appreciation for all the hard work we'd done to entertain them over the years. I got pretty emotional about it. I still do. When you have that many good memories, it's hard to walk away. Soon after that, WWE advised Nigel that they wanted him to get bicep surgery before they would sign him. Not only could Nigel not afford the surgery, but he was receiving a different, conflicting message from his own doctor, who kept telling him that his bicep was healed already. Nigel refused the surgery, and WWE rescinded their contract offer. Ultimately, he signed with TNA, and after doing really well for a year there, he ended up needing to stop wrestling entirely because of his health. As far as my health, doctors never found out why my liver enzymes were so high, and remain high today. They ran all the typical tests, and all the results came back clean. Once I had passed all the tests, my medical paperwork finally went through, and WWE pushed through my contract on October 2nd, 2009, almost 10 years to the day of when I had my first match. From pro to bro. When WWE offered me a contract, I came in with low expectations. Several of my friends had wrestled in WWE and expressed their frustration with the lack of opportunities. I also knew I had to change my style. I was used to wrestling 20 minutes every night in matches that made me popular with the independent wrestling fans. Most WWE TV matches are under 5 minutes. If you're not winning the short match and you don't get interview time, it's hard to establish yourself as a character, much less get the fans to care about you. One of my early frustrations, before WWE even knew what they wanted to do with me, was the issue of my name. I'd always been known as the American Dragon, but sometime in 2002, Ring of Honor booker Gabe Sapolsky told me he thought we should start using my real name as well, so it didn't sound so much like a cartoon. I finally stopped wearing the mask at that point, so the American Dragon could just become more of a moniker. I liked the idea, and it didn't take very long for me to be booked as Bryan Danielson almost everywhere I went, with two exceptions. New Japan, they didn't want to confuse fans, to whom I was introduced with this name during my first Far East visit, and All-Star Wrestling. England was the last place where I still wrestled under a mask to make me more kid-friendly. However, before I started in WWE, John Laurinaitis called to inform me that I needed to come up with a new name, something WWE could license and own. When he told me it couldn't be my real name, I argued that I had a decent following as Bryan Danielson, and that a lot of guys in WWE use their real names, including John Cena. Well, we don't do that anymore, he said. He wanted me to come up with a list of 10 names. The first person I called was William Regal, whom I asked for some input. We both liked the name Buddy because it was fun and it was my dad's name. We next came up with some absurd last names to go with it, most notably Peacock, based on an English wrestler named Steve Peacock. I thought of using my middle name, Lloyd, so that went on the list as well. Then Regal brought up the idea of using Daniel because he thought it was a strong name. With that, a light bulb went on in his head, and he came up with the name Daniel Bryan. Regal thought it would be a great idea because anybody who'd heard of me on the independents would easily be able to tell that it was the same guy. It sounded weird as I said it, but all the names sounded weird except my own anyhow. I put it on the list, along with Buddy Peacock and my favorite, Lloyd Boner. In December, I traveled home to Aberdeen for Christmas, thinking there was no way WWE was going to call me up until after the first of the year. I indulged in 10 days of Christmas gluttony. Sugar cookies, pumpkin cake, cinnamon rolls, nothing was off limits. That, of course, was when WWE called, the Saturday after Christmas. To put it mildly, I was concerned. After eating all those sweets and barely working out for 10 days, I felt like the fattest man alive. How much damage one can do in that amount of time is debatable, but it didn't matter because it affected my confidence. To make matters worse, I was still ailing from my third staph infection of the year. Plus, I hadn't wrestled in months, a critical detail, since, as the old wrestling saying goes, the only thing that can get you in shape for wrestling is wrestling. When I got to the show that Monday, I was actually relieved to learn I wasn't doing something to air on TV. I wrestled Chavo Guerrero in an untelevised match before the show. That match against Chavo was only the second time I'd ever gotten blown up, a phrase used in wrestling for when someone gets really tired in a match, to the point that it affects performance, in my 10-year career. The first time was my 40-minute-plus match with Paul London in 2003, when I weighed my heaviest at 205 pounds. With the combination of eating horrible food, not wrestling for months, and my nerves, by the end of the 7-minute match with Chavo, I was sucking wind. Everyone told me it was good, but I didn't feel my best. And if I was going to debut on TV, nothing less than my best was acceptable. With that in mind, I asked to go spend a week down at FCW, WWE's developmental program in Tampa, to shake off the ring rust and get back into wrestling shape. After only a week there, where I mainly wrestled low-key, I felt infinitely more confident. My plan was to ask to go there 1 week each month until they were ready to have me start on WWE programming. But right before I was about to leave Florida, 7 other guys and I were pulled into an office by the trainers, Dusty Rhodes, Norman Smiley, and Tom Pritchard, Dr. Tom. They gave us the good news that we were all being called up to TV. WWE was debuting a new show called WWE NXT, a hybrid of wrestling and reality TV that was going to replace the ECW program that aired on Tuesday nights. They didn't have a lot of details, though we were told it would be some sort of competition/reality show. At first, it didn't feel real, but the next day, they had us shooting all sorts of pictures and videos for the show. We were all excited for the opportunity, especially some of the guys who had spent years in developmental without getting their break. Shortly before the premiere on February 23, 2010, we were given a little more info on the show. We were going to be called rookies, and we would each have a pro, somebody who had been in WWE for a while and was assigned to teach us the ropes in the big leagues. WWE revealed the pro and rookie pairings online, which is how I found out my pro would be The Miz. Even though the whole thing was fiction, the fans who followed me on the independents were outraged. I had years of wrestling experience and had become relatively well known as an excellent wrestler, whereas Miz had way less experience and struggled with credibility among the hardcore audience. Originally, I wanted Regal to be my pro because of our history, but I quickly realized being paired with The Miz gave me a built-in story. We had an interesting dynamic because Miz was everything I wasn't. He was good on the microphone and carried himself like a star. We both thought the concept of Miz, this arrogant, overbearing Hollywood egotist, trying to turn a bland, independent wrestler into a WWE superstar would be a great story to tell. I even tried to make myself look more generic to fit in. I cut both my beard and my longer hair and avoided using my nicely designed ring gear, instead wearing plain maroon trunks and gear. As it turned out, WWE decided not to leverage any of that detail in the story, and I just made myself look uninteresting. Chalk that up to a lesson learned. Initially, I felt lucky to have that entertaining contrast with my pro, but I was also fortunate that Miz actually wanted to be there participating in NXT, because when we came in, most of the other pros didn't. At the time, WWE superstars didn't typically work on both Monday, Raw, and Tuesday, SmackDown. You were typically on one or the other, not both. The selected pros who were used to going home on Tuesday after Raw were pissed because they had to spend an extra day on the road, and the ones who were there for Tuesday night's show were already aggravated because it took them away from focusing on their segments for SmackDown. The Miz didn't complain at all. Instead, he saw it as an opportunity and spent time with me to find ways we could make our partnership stand out. He genuinely wanted what we did to be good. The more I saw how hard he worked, the more I respected him. I also learned a lot from him on how to navigate the political waters in WWE. He's also somewhat of a perfectionist. If he wasn't content with what we were doing, he would talk to as many people as he could to get it changed. Sometimes he was successful, sometimes he wasn't. But watching him handle it all was really helpful in familiarizing myself with the world of WWE. As I mentioned earlier, the inaugural episode of NXT went really well. So well, in fact, that I thought for sure I was a ringer for the show, a natural favorite. It turns out that wasn't the case at all. On the second episode, they had me heavily tape my ribs from the match with Chris Jericho the previous week, in which I did a suicide dive onto Jericho and hit my ribs hard on the announce table, instantly bruising me up. WWE.com covered it, and the moment was replayed during my entrance, so it was fresh in fans' minds. That night, in week 2, I wrestled Jericho's rookie on the show, Wade Barrett, who beat me in 3 minutes. There was an embarrassing moment when I slipped trying to do a springboard into the ring, but Wade covered it perfectly by immediately hitting me with his finish and pinning me. At the announce booth, Jericho helped out the situation as well, because he was on commentary and claimed that I slipped because of my damaged ribs, then took all the credit for Wade's victory. After the match, without warning, Chris started beating me up and put me in a submission hold, the walls of Jericho, essentially a modified Boston Crab. I didn't know it was coming, and it wasn't pre-planned. Chris was on commentary, and Vince directed him over the headset to do it. For most of the season, we rookies had no idea what was going to happen on each show, but there were times when the pros didn't know either. The next few shows fell in line with the story I expected. Miz and I teamed together, and he ended up getting pinned because he and I were arguing. Also around this time, I realized that moving to Florida was a complete waste of time. FCW was only able to book me on a handful of shows because of the number of people with developmental contracts who needed the experience. The matches I did have were mostly multi-person tag matches with the other 7 NXT rookies, so I'd only be able to get in the ring for a couple of minutes. The last match I did for FCW was the straw that broke the camel's back. We were doing a 4-on-4 tag match, and due to some sort of confusion or mishap, I didn't even get tagged into the match. After that, I spoke with Dr. Tom and decided I need to move back to Las Vegas, where I'd be able to at least stay in shape with my grappling and kickboxing and keep my kicks sharp. Instead of driving myself across the country, I paid my friend Christoph to drive my car back, and like what happened on my drive to Florida, my car ended up breaking down on him as well. Fortunately, Christoph got it fixed and into Vegas just in time for me to move into my new apartment. Perfect timing, actually, because NXT was being taped in my city that following Tuesday. A week after my loss to Khali, things took a turn for the worse. We were in San Jose, California for Miz's second week in a row of not being on the show, and they had me teaming with Michael Tarver against Darren Young and David Otunga. I learned of the match from producer Mike Rotunda, who told me I was scheduled to lose in order to keep up the losing streak gimmick. I was a little taken aback. I'd lost every match on NXT so far, but there were reasons for each loss that advanced the story with Miz and me. With him not there, they just decided to turn the story into a losing streak. WWE had tried this several times with other wrestlers previously, and it never really worked. They would usually just forget about it, and the fans would just start seeing the guy as a loser. I started getting a little worried. The next day, I had my first, and really my only, experience of disrespect by another superstar, while headed from San Jose to Phoenix for my first ever WrestleMania with WWE. All of us who performed on the SmackDown and NXT tapings were on the same flight, including the NXT rookies. The 8 of us were sitting in booths near a food court at the airport, along with Regal. Ezekiel Jackson, a muscular 300-pound guy who had only been wrestling for a couple of years, came up to us and said, "Which one of you rookies has an aisle seat?" He had a middle seat and wasn't happy about it. "I do," I said. "Not anymore, you don't," he responded. I could see what was going on, but still replied, "What do you mean?" "I'm taking it," he said. The previous night, the losing streak thing, already had me frustrated, and I didn't feel like taking any shit. "No, actually, you're not," I said, "and actually, had you asked nicely, I would have gladly given you my seat, but since you didn't, I'll just give it to somebody else." Jackson was infuriated, but just as he was about to respond, Regal chastised him. "Do you even know who you're talking to?" he said. "This man is like a son to me, and has more talent in his little finger than you have in your entire body." With that, Jackson left, and I gave my aisle seat to someone else and took his middle seat. After that, my WrestleMania week was a blast. We had a handful of appearances, though not many. I had one signing where I replaced Evan Bourne, who was pretty popular at the time. He had a line of substantial size when I replaced him, and when the announcement was made about it, the crowd's disappointment was audible as half of the line left. I ventured around the city using public transportation, trying to find the best vegan food. Ring of Honor was doing their yearly shows in the vicinity of WrestleMania, so I went to one of them, hitching a ride with some fans who were going as well, including one who is a radio DJ in Philadelphia and interviews me regularly today to promote upcoming shows. On Sunday of that weekend, we actually got to participate in WrestleMania 26. Not in any big way, but we still got to go out there. On the pay-per-view pre-show, there was a big battle royal, and since we were considered rookies, they sent us out to the stage to watch, so we could learn. The winner of the battle royal was Yoshitatsu, a Japanese wrestler I competed against once in New Japan when he was a young boy. I guided him through that match, and it mildly amused me that I was now out there pretending to learn from him. On that show, I actually did learn from, and was emotionally touched by, Shawn Michaels' retirement match against The Undertaker. It was by far the best match on the show. Not only that, with a crowd of 72,000 people and the atmosphere being simply electric, it might be the most memorable match I've ever seen live. I watched it from the stands so I could take in the entirety of it. Shawn Michaels trained me, and there I was, my first WrestleMania and his last. For the NXT After WrestleMania, they advertised the first results of the Pros Poll, a legitimate vote by the WWE Pros ranking each of our abilities to be WWE superstars. Since they just had the pros write down their genuine thoughts on our standings, I ended up being ranked number 1, despite not having won a single match. I can imagine the fans were very confused, given the idea that winning and losing is supposed to matter. The Pros Poll was important because you were eliminated from the show if you came in last. The first one, however, was just a demonstration. No one would be eliminated until week 12 of the competition, we were told. Still, I felt confident that no matter how many matches I lost, as long as the voting was legitimate, I would do fairly well on the show. The following week, WWE changed plans entirely on what NXT would be, and they essentially turned it into a joke. Instead of making it a vehicle for us to exhibit our skills as wrestlers, they decided to fill the show with silly challenges that have nothing to do with wrestling. We carried kegs, ran obstacle courses, and jousted like the American Gladiators in a contest called Rock'em Sock'em Rookies. The only reason to care was that if you won the challenges, you got points, and by the time we did the first elimination, whoever had the most points was immune to being ejected. But the challenges were so inane and demoralizing that by the end, we all treated them as a joke. Except, that is, for Skip Sheffield, later known as the Ryback, who demonstrated an undeniable will to win even the most idiotic game. On top of the challenges, the commentators consistently kept putting us down, especially Michael Cole. Any little mistake in the ring or on the microphone would be called out instantly, and the audience would be reminded of how we were just rookies. I was persistently ragged on for being a nerd, ostensibly because I had wrestled on the independent so long and had a decent-sized following on the internet. Instead of us doing things to make us more popular, we were treated like fools. It's hard for me to imagine The Undertaker ever becoming the legend he is today if, when you first saw him, he was falling off greased monkey bars while the announcers told you he was stupid for trying to be a dead man. Then again, it's possible WWE never saw the potential in any of us to be that kind of star. Even though my character ended up being a nerd who lost every match, I finished NXT a resounding 0-10. I tried to stay positive. This one week, midway through the season, after he came out of a TV production meeting, Arn Anderson told me the only way I'd ever get a real opportunity was if the fans got behind me. He told me he believed in me and assured me that the fans can tell when someone is the real deal. 1 week prior to the first elimination, in another unscripted interview, Matt Stryker asked each of us at the end of the show who we thought should be eliminated. Most guys pinpointed Michael Tarver because of his bad attitude, but since I'd lost him earlier in the night, it didn't make sense story-wise for me to say him. Since I had lost to everyone else on the show, it didn't make sense for me to say any of the others either. So, thinking it was the right, humble, good guy thing to do, having not won a match, I said I should be eliminated. Afterward, Miz told me I shouldn't have even put that perception in the fans' minds. I was facing an uphill battle as it was. To me, it seemed logical. Plus, I figured there was no way I'd place last in the pros poll and get eliminated. When it was time for the first elimination the following Tuesday, we were told to line up by the ring before the show started, again without being told what was going on. Stryker came out and reminded the fans that the previous week he asked us who should be eliminated. Michael Tarver had said himself as well, with his justification being everyone was safer without him around. Stryker then said, WWE management feels that if a superstar does not believe in himself, then how can anyone believe in the WWE superstar? And with that, he told Michael Tarver he had been eliminated by management. After Tarver exited, Stryker walked slowly down the line toward me. They replayed the video of me saying I should be eliminated, and I knew what was coming. Stryker announced that I was eliminated as well. As I slowly walked up the ramp to exit, a million things were going through my mind, but the one that kept sticking in my brain was that WWE did this to prove a point. All the things I'd heard from guys like Colt Cabana about WWE's negative feelings toward independent wrestlers seemed to be confirmed. Given that I'd been the flag bearer for independent wrestling over those last few years, it all of a sudden made sense why they would mock me on the show, despite me being one of the best performers. Then I thought they might just fire me after this and I'd go back to the independents as a failure. When I walked through the gorilla position, a space immediately on the other side of the curtain, named after Gorilla Monsoon, I was informed I'd have an interview with Stryker after the commercial break, and that I should just answer however I felt was right. The interview started off fine, with a fairly harmless question from Stryker about whether I thought the whole thing was fair. I knew Matt was fed his questions by producers and probably Vince himself, but the second question was insulting. He asked, "Do you regret leaving the independent scene, where you were a big fish in a small pond, to ultimately drown in the sea that is WWE?" Fuck you. In no way, shape, or form did I drown in WWE. I was booked as a loser and was still the most popular guy on the show. This only confirmed to me what I thought coming up the ramp, but I answered relatively calmly. "Well, that's funny, because Daniel Bryan never wrestled on the independent scene," I said. "If you go on and YouTube Daniel Bryan, all you ever see is WWE. But there was this guy. Man, he was out there. He was kicking people's heads in. People called him the best wrestler in the world. He was a champion in Japan, Mexico, and Europe. And do you know what his name was?" Before I could say it, Stryker cut me off, saying, "What's next for this guy?" I could practically hear the yelling in his earpiece, but I continued on. I downplayed the skill of Daniel Bryan, saying that guy couldn't even beat rookies. And then I said it. Daniel Bryan might be done, but Bryan Danielson, God knows what's going to happen to him. When I said my real name, it actually got a reaction from the fans. It got a reaction from Vince as well. Apparently, he threw his headset. I was in the frame of mind that if I was going to get fired, I was at least going to plug my own name before heading back to the independents. But because NXT wasn't quite live, it was on an hour delay, they made me redo the interview, and Stryker asked different questions. When the show aired, however, they played the original on TV. Vince must have changed his mind in the meantime. It seems to me that Vince's perception of me is always changing. It's actually strange to think about what somebody else is thinking about me. I've never really worried about it, but when one man can change the whole dynamic of your career, you tend to wonder. When I first started on NXT, I got the distinct impression that Vince didn't like me. After the first episode, Jericho came back and told Vince he thought I was great in the ring, but otherwise, Vince's reaction to me was, "Ugh, he doesn't even eat meat." Then I thought he just liked to pick on me. Shortly after NXT started, all 8 NXT rookies joined about 6 other superstars each week before TV for what they called promo class, which was led by Vince himself. Vince would call people up to the front and have them cut promos on random subjects. You had 10 seconds to think, and then you just had to go. Afterward, he'd ask other people in the room what they thought of your promo, and then he'd give you his own opinion. He was very hands-on. From our very first class, it seemed like he singled me out. He had me cut a promo on a table, and it was rotten. I got nervous because I'd never done anything like that before, and it was in front of many people I respected, like Rey Mysterio and Fit Finlay. Every promo class, he called me up, sometimes more than once, but with each class, I grew more confident, and I got better. One promo class, he decided to make us the teachers. First, he had Big Show go up and teach, then Matt Hardy. Between the two of them, they pretty much said everything that Vince had taught us, and they called up different people in the class to do promos as well. Neither of them called me up, so when Matt was done, Vince stood up and told me to go teach the class. It was a horrible position to be in. At least Matt and Show were veterans in WWE. Nobody wanted to be taught by a guy in NXT who wasn't even known as giving a good promo. Regardless, I went up and tried to keep it short, not repeating anything Show or Matt had said. I pretty much just told everyone how important I thought it was to be yourself, then work from there to identify your strengths and weaknesses. When it was time to call somebody up to cut a promo, I named Vince. His topic? How great Daniel Bryan is. Vince stood there in front of the class, silent. Then he looked me up and down, judgingly, before his face turned to various levels of disgust, amping it up as he went along. Vince never said a word for about a full minute, and then he said he was done. He went to sit back down, and I stopped him, requesting he stand up front while the class critiqued his promo. I first called on Big Show, who put it over the moon. The next person did the same, and they were right. It was great, and the whole room was laughing. I excused Vince to go sit down, but then he said there was a lesson there. He taught us about the importance of facial expressions and how to say something without saying anything. It was really good. The last time Vince called me up in front of promo class was one that included everybody on the roster. When I was called upon, I accidentally knocked over my bottle of water, spilling it all over the floor. I was embarrassed, but then he started asking people how that incident made them feel about me. Most said it made them feel sympathetic toward me. Next, he asked me a series of questions, definitely not the usual class protocol of having me cut a promo on something random. Vince made a statement, then said nothing. I asked if there was a question there, and he said there wasn't. So I just stood there in front of the room, with neither of us saying anything. I thought he was trying to embarrass me, but then he asked, "What are you doing right now?" "Nothing," I said. "Close," Vince said, then asked me again, "What are you doing right now?" I was clueless. Close to nothing? Miz let out a groan in sympathy, as if he'd been rooting for me to respond with the right answer and I completely blew it. Vince chuckled. "No," he said, "you are using the silence." And with that, he excused me to sit down. On my way out the door, Vince pulled me aside and said, "You know I'm doing this for a reason, right?" I lied and told him I did, but more importantly, that was the first time I thought he saw more in me than I knew. Even today, he will occasionally bring up how much better my promos got after that experience, and they truly did. After I was eliminated from NXT, WWE told me they would call me when they needed me, which they guessed wouldn't be until the season finale. Plans change rapidly in WWE though, and they called me back to be on the show the very next week to initiate a story with Michael Cole, stemming from all the times he put me down on commentary. It was the first time on NXT that I was able to prepare for promos, using the instruction I learned in promo class, and it was by far the best talking I'd ever done. We went back and forth verbally, and ultimately physically, as I ended up tackling Cole into the barricade as he ran away. We combined this with a continued rivalry with Miz, and it turned into good television. WWE liked it so much that they ended up using our story to turn Cole into a heel on Raw as well. The final episode of NXT ended with Wade Barrett winning the season, and, as part of the story, earning a spot on the main roster. Even though I didn't win, I was confident that WWE would continue to feature me, given how well the stuff went with Cole and all. As I sat with the eliminated rookies in the front row, watching the final episode, I was thrilled NXT was over, and I looked forward to moving on to the next step, whatever that would be. Matters of the chart. The Monday after NXT was finished, all 8 of us rookies were brought to Raw in Miami. We had no idea why. We still had to dress separately from everyone else in the locker room, in a dirty, draped-off space next to the catering area. Midway through the day, Laurinaitis pulled us all into Vince's office, where we waited until Vince and Michael Hayes, a former wrestling star and one of the top match producers in WWE today, came in. Vince told us they had a plan, but it was of the utmost importance we not tell anybody outside of those in the room. If we did, it would ruin it, and if they heard of any of us telling anybody, that person would be fired. We were going to do something that had never been done before on WWE television. It would happen in the main event, in which John Cena's opponent was to be picked by the fans whose choices were Rey Mysterio, Jack Swagger, and CM Punk. They thought Rey winning was a pretty sure thing, but when you leave things up to the fans, you never know what you're going to get, and Punk ended up winning the vote. I'm not sure how much Punk was briefed on what was going to happen, but after all 8 of us got into our ring gear early in the day, if anyone asked why we were dressed, we just told them we had to shoot some photos. We lied to everybody, including people we trusted. I even lied about it to Regal. While Cena and Punk were wrestling, the winner of NXT, Wade Barrett, came strolling down the ramp. Shortly thereafter, the rest of the rookies, including myself, came through the crowd and jumped over the barricade. Punk had the Straight Edge Society with him, so we beat up his associate Luke Gallows, and Serena ran off. Punk got out of the ring and we beat him up too. Then all of us hopped on the apron and stared down Cena, the biggest star in WWE. We all slowly stepped into the ring, and the 8 of us surrounded him. That's when the mayhem ensued, and the Nexus was born. We all beat up Cena, then got out of the ring to destroy everything in sight. We tore apart the ring, exposing the wooden beams underneath. We beat up security, we cut up the mat, we tore off the ropes, and we ripped apart the mats on the floor. We created chaos. In the process, we even beat up ring announcer Justin Roberts, stripping off his jacket and shirt. Vince and Michael had told us directly that they wanted a gang-style beatdown, and that's what we gave them. Keep in mind that I hadn't been in WWE very long. I knew some of the rules, like no bleeding, and I knew it was a PG company, but I didn't know what exactly was PG and what wasn't. In the middle of this gang-style beatdown, I saw Justin Roberts lying there, no shirt on, and tie still around his neck. In moments like this, I always thought violence was good for believability, so I grabbed the long end of his tie from behind and pulled it back. Hard. The cameras picked up on it right away because it was a great visual. Justin, on his stomach, being choked by the tie around his neck, his face turning purple. Some people thought he was just selling goofy, but he wasn't. I don't trust non-wrestling people to sell very well, especially when it comes to a big, important angle, so it's better to be a little rough as long as you don't hurt them. I pulled on the tie so hard it left long red marks on his neck. Amid the melee, somebody from the production crew came to me on the side, saying, "No choking, no choking." I stopped and heard it just in time, because I was about to choke somebody else with one of the cable wires at ringside. When we broke the ring, Heath Slater grabbed one of the ring ropes and was about to wrap it around Cena's neck, but John whispered, "No choking," to him as well. Inside the ring, we were all given a moment to shine, with each of us hitting Cena with a signature move, mine being a simple kick to the head as he rested on his knees, execution style. Prior to this whole fiasco, Cena pulled me aside and said the most important thing isn't the move, it's what you do before the move. Looking back, I assume he was probably thinking of some sort of hand motion or something. Instead, I looked him dead in the eyes and screamed, "You're not better than me." I then spit in the face of WWE's biggest star and kicked him in the skull. When we got back through the curtain, everybody thought the beatdown was awesome. Then somebody shouted, "Who was choking Justin Roberts?" They couldn't see because the camera was focused exclusively on Justin's purple face. I stepped forward and said, that was me." "And who spit on John Cena?" they asked. "That was me too," I responded. Apparently, choking and spitting are two of the things not allowed within the PG guidelines of WWE programming, but I had no clue. Of course, we didn't need the choke, nor did we need the spit. But elements like that showed our disdain and added to the brutality of the whole thing. The fundamental reason our characters did all of that was that we were pissed off after being treated like jokes for an entire season of NXT, and I just did the most violent and malicious things I could think of. The parameters of PG never crossed my mind. I apologized to everyone and made a special point to apologize to Justin and Cena. Neither of them seemed to care, and part of me thinks Justin thought it was pretty cool. I'd known him since 2002. He loved wrestling, and I think he was happy to have had such a memorable part in the moment, despite the marks on his neck. The Nexus attack happened on Monday. Then Tuesday, we all went to SmackDown, but didn't do anything on the show. As I walked down the halls at SmackDown, I passed Michael Hayes. "Daniel, what did you learn last night?" he asked. "No choking, no spitting," I replied. "That's right. It's okay to make mistakes as long as you learn from them," Michael said. I thought I was in the clear. That Wednesday, WWE booked me on an FCW show down in Florida. Miz was on the show too, and as we sat in the locker room talking about the whole thing, he reassured me not to worry about it. He said they would all forget about it by next week. 2 days later, June 11th, 2010, I got the second and last call I've ever received from Vince McMahon. I didn't know it was him at first because it came from a blocked number, but as I answered, I had a sinking feeling that it wasn't good news. When I picked up, I knew right away it was really Vince, and this time there was no feeling that it was a rib. He said, "You know, Daniel, I'm sorry I have to do this. I feel really bad, but we have guidelines as far as what's PG and what's not PG, and unfortunately you broke those guidelines. I'm sorry, but we're going to have to let you go." My reaction to being fired was different than even I would have expected of myself. I felt liberated, as if an enormous burden had been lifted off my shoulders. I thanked Vince for the opportunity, and after he expressed his regret one last time, I responded, "Don't be sorry. I'll make more money now this year than I did with you guys, so don't be sorry for me at all." It was a weird thing for me to say, because I'm not overly money-driven, but all I saw was opportunity. There was no better time to be fired than after a hot angle like the Nexus's debut, especially because I essentially got fired for being too violent. And a lot of independent fans hated the sanitized version of wrestling that's required to be PG. I knew they would see the whole thing not only as an injustice, but also as proof that the only place they could see the kind of wrestling they liked was on the independents. The comment I made about the money must have really reverberated with Vince, because Johnny asked me, "Did you tell Vince you were going to make more money on the indies?" I told him I did, and it was the truth. There's a lot that people don't understand about our lives as WWE wrestlers. For one, when we sign our contracts, we are guaranteed a certain amount of money, called your downside. With the exception of top guys, usually it's not very much, and my contract was for substantially less than I made working on the independents. In WWE, the idea is that if you are booked most of the time, you will make far more than your downside. But since I wasn't on many shows, I only made the minimum. It was by no means a struggle to get by, but I wasn't saving as much money as I had hoped. Also, in WWE, the wrestlers are responsible for paying for their own hotels and rental cars, whereas on the independents, all of that was taken care of. WWE takes care of those expenses for anyone under a developmental contract who's brought up on the road for TV. I was actually the only member of NXT not on a developmental contract, but I was lucky to be able to jump in with the other guys. Anyhow, Laurinaitis told me Vince said I could start working independent dates as soon as I wanted, as long as it wasn't for television or pay-per-view. That was all I needed to hear. As soon as I got off with Johnny, I called Gabe Sapolsky, who was booking shows for both Dragon Gate USA and Evolve. When he picked up the phone, I said, "Gabe, we're going to make a lot of money." As a side note, what I considered a lot of money, some people would laugh at. It's all relative. If I showed Steve Austin how much I made during the time I was fired, he would not be impressed. My family, however, was very impressed, and so was I. Gabe and I were both very excited. We discussed some ideas, and Gabe later got me hooked up with a graphic designer to quickly create a new t-shirt and launch a website that would basically be a vehicle to sell the shirts he was going to design. I had never been one to try to sell much merchandise when I was on the independents. I hated producing it, and I hated sitting out by a merchandise table trying to sell it. I knew, though, that if I didn't do it, I'd miss out on the opportunity. In the span of a couple of hours, I had turned into a full-blown capitalist. I put Gabe in charge of dealing with other promoters who wanted to book me. Given the circumstances, I could charge a lot more for appearances and bookings, but I didn't want to haggle with promoters, so I left that to him. To start, Gabe booked me for the upcoming shows he had, then we decided to talk again the next day to figure out where to go from there. By the time I got off the phone with Gabe, WWE had announced my firing on WWE.com. All of a sudden, I got what felt like a million calls and text messages, including ones from Regal and Shawn Michaels. Regal, especially, gave me some great advice, yet again, which was to make sure I didn't publicly disparage WWE. He had no doubt that if I kept my nose clean within a year or two, I'd be back, though I wasn't sure I even wanted to be. In the wrestling world, my firing seemed like a big thing. At least it was the most talked about thing that had ever happened in my career. Within days, my schedule for the next 3 months was full. 3 shows per weekend, every weekend, for far more money than I had ever made before. For a full week, I lay low and just tried to appreciate the calm before my schedule got crazy busy. 10 days after I was fired, the website was up, and I couldn't believe how fast the shirts were selling. It was actually quite stressful because I decided to ship them out myself to save a little money, and the shirts weren't going to be ready for a few days. I sold 2 designs, a gray one that said Team Bryan on it, and a maroon shirt with my bloody face Obamaconned, a picture taken out of a Mexican wrestling magazine. Underneath my face, instead of saying change like Obama's campaign poster, it said violent. It was perfect. My first show, 2 weeks after being fired, was in Detroit for a company I'd previously worked for called Chikara, itself a family-friendly company. Before I was announced for the show, they had fewer than 100 tickets sold, and after the announcement, they ended up selling several hundred. The event was held at a swap meet with no bathroom or shower in the dressing room, no bottled water or catering. I felt right at home. When I came to the ring, instead of throwing streamers into the ring, a Japanese custom that had been adopted by American independent wrestling fans, they all threw neckties. After the show, I went out to the merchandise stand to sell the shirts and 8x10s, and I was genuinely moved by the support a lot of the fans gave me. They were more pissed off than I was, seeing the whole thing as unfair and typical WWE. The way they cared for me warmed my heart. My return to WWE was a very well-kept secret. I flew into Los Angeles that Sunday morning of the event on August 15th and checked into a different hotel than the one where the rest of the talent and crew stayed that week for all the events leading up to SummerSlam. WWE hired me a private car to take me to the Staples Center, and I didn't arrive until well after the pay-per-view started. They told me to wear a hooded sweatshirt and nondescript clothes so that no one would identify or notice me as I was hurried from the car to a private locker room. When I arrived backstage, I was told to hang tight, so I just waited. Shortly thereafter, all the guys in the match were brought back to the room. With the exception of a few guys on John Cena's team, I don't think anybody else knew I was in the match. Jamie Noble was one of the producers for the match, and he had already worked with a couple of Nexus guys to go over the things the surprise seventh man might want to do. But those things were generic enough that most of them didn't put it together until they saw me. I wasn't going to actually be in the match very much, so I just had to work out a couple of things with some people. Despite the pressure of being in the SummerSlam main event, I wasn't worried about the wrestling part of it at all. What made me most nervous was the reaction I would get coming out. I was pretty concerned that when Cena announced me as the final member of the team, the crowd would have an anticlimactic reaction. Cena's team consisted of mostly established stars. Bret Hart, Chris Jericho, and Edge were all on the team, and usually surprises are supposed to be big. Prior to being fired, I'd lost pretty much every match on TV and was portrayed as a nerd/loser by commentators. I assumed the casual WWE fan would be like, "What? Why on earth did they choose this guy?" The concern weighed heavy on my mind before the match. They wanted me to continue wearing my hoodie so no one would see me as I walked to the gorilla position for my entrance, which I thought was a little excessive given it was only moments before the match. After the match, I learned that WWE.com revealed that I was the seventh guy minutes before I came out. Given all the secrecy the entire day, I thought that was pretty funny. When John Cena announced me as the surprise member for his team, in no way did I get a megastar reaction from the Staples Center crowd. But it wasn't the apathetic reaction I had anticipated either. I'd say it was more like polite applause that rapidly shifted in my favor when I started the match and I got a quick submission on Darren Young, who tapped out to the label lock. The match was structured so I wasn't in the ring much, but each time I was, I looked great. I didn't come in for a second time until well after 20 minutes, but I came in like a house of fire, and after I hit a suicide dive to the floor, the crowd started chanting my name. It had worked. I then submitted Heath Slater, again using the label lock, and one night I was instantly made more important than I had ever seemed during my entire time on NXT. A few moments later, Miz, who wasn't in the match, ran in to hit me with his briefcase because he was fictionally upset that he wasn't chosen as Cena's seventh man instead of his one-time rookie. Miz's actions led to my elimination from the match, which was great for me because it also easily led into a story with Miz going forward. I considered it a very successful night. Well, for me at least. After I was eliminated, it came down to Cena against Wade Barrett and Justin Gabriel, and Cena beat both of them. The Nexus had created a lot of interest, and the group needed a win to solidify themselves as a force to be reckoned with. They didn't get the victory when they needed it, and after SummerSlam, they went from being dangerous guys with an edge to just another faction of bad guys. The night immediately after SummerSlam, we taped 2 episodes of Monday Night Raw because the Raw crew was headed overseas. I was feeling good about the pay-per-view, and I was eager to engage in the new story with Miz. The first Raw went really well, even though I lost a quick match to Nexus member Michael Tarver. It was due to Miz's interference and resulted in a brawl between Miz and me. During the second taping, I had to run out and attack Miz in the ring. I thought it went well, but when I got back through the curtain, Vince was furious.
All right. That's all we have for today. We got Yes, the book by Daniel Bryan, audiobook part 1, which is the book of Yes, My Improbable Journey to the Main Event of WrestleMania. Great book thus far. We get into the part where Daniel Bryan is back in WWE after being released back in 2010. So, with that being said, we'll get another part of the Daniel Bryan audiobook. Keep the notification bell on, like, subscribe to the channel so you can know when these audiobook part 2 will be released. And as stated earlier, when I have part 2, the link to this particular part will be in the description. So keep an eye out for that. Thank you, all you guys for coming out today, checking out this great audiobook. I hope you liked it and enjoyed it. Soon, 2 videos will pop up. The first one will be Mayor Came My Life in Wrestling and Politics, audio part 1. Second one will be Mayor Came My Life in Wrestling and Politics, audio part 2. Until then, it is OUT.